Okay. Joe, I will let you start back up.
Okay, thanks, Chris. But I'm going to let you start back up as well. This is, again, I want to thank the speakers, Hagen, Greg, and Kevin, that you provided a lot of meaty information in a very short amount of time. I wish we actually had more information because we could probably spend all day with you talking about what you've learned and where we might want to focus efforts going into the future. This is a time where all of the EAC members, and you probably got a list of who all those folks were. Hopefully you did. And they represent a wide range of institutions and organizations in this electricity industry. This is the time where we're going to go and really get into some questions and answers. Answers primarily coming from you. And Chris, Lawrence, you did such a great job yesterday of really reaching out to everybody in the EAC and fielding the questions. If you wouldn't mind going ahead and doing that, because I don't think I could replicate it, that would be really, really useful.
All right, Joe, I appreciate that. So here's what we're going to do. I've got 3 people that have already said in the chat box that they have questions for the group. But what I will ask is, just to make life a little easier, if you could raise your hand rather than type in the chat box. And again, these questions are only for EAC members. To ask the general public, if you wish to ask questions or make a comment, is during the public comment period time. So with that being said, now I have Wanda Reeder, followed by Mladen, followed by Jay, and then Bob Cummings. If you want to raise your hand, you just hover over your name, and the option should be available to do that. That's so Darlene and Tom Bialy. Okay, so with that being said, Wanda, you're up.
All right. Well, terrific presentation by all. I really appreciated it. There's so much technology here, and and in addition to that, the workforce piece continued to come up in all 3 presentations. And we've heard that, technology can even outpace the ability for both people and organization to be able to adopt it and use it. So my question really is twofold. One is if you can reflect a little bit more on how you're preparing your internal workforce to actually do the analytics and to create value out of it for internal folks, a competency set that was recognized that's not necessarily there natively. And the other one is the organizational procedures. We've been so attuned to let it break, fix it, kind of. Now proactively, how are we weaving that new mindset into asset management and operational procedures? Any 3 or all, welcome to address it.
Well, I guess I'll give it a start since I'm the operational guy here for now. I think that's a good question, and that's the question that the first part is how do we develop our workforce? There's probably not a single approach that gets us all there. It's a combination of things. Obviously, naturally as a utility, we all enjoy fairly low turnover in our workforce. And so the natural way to go is to really invest in our existing workforce, either in the business analytics community or in the engineering community, and really provide training, mentoring, and online training classes. It's usually employee driven. Those that want to innovate, they want to participate in that, they're driving that, and we're just making sure we are having the resources available for them to educate themselves to do the things that they're engaged in and challenge them with use cases where they can apply. It's sort of like how we learn to do Excel by getting a spreadsheet and trying to get it work. That's an effective way to train people. but we're also supplementing the people with new skill sets that are coming in from the outside, either through consulting firms or through hiring, that are having the education in the data science space so that we can supplement our existing folks. So it's a combination of things, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Sorry, do you have thoughts? I'll let you go first before I answer.
Sure. So yeah, I would agree with that. And Wanda, you really hit on the primary two bottlenecks that I perceive for our company to be able to grow these competencies. So the answer is one person at a time, one use case at a time, and let that growth be organic, and let the value that you create drive it. If you try to come down with a top-down, enterprise-wide, we're going to change everything. At least at our company, I don't think that would succeed. And to accommodate the pace of that sort of one at a time and grow slowly approach, you know, the way that we've done that is we've leveraged outside partnerships. So with vendors and companies and people that can much better attract these skill sets than what a utility can. I think we're really going to have to come to terms with the fact that the people that are the best at what they do at these things aren't going to want to come and work for a utility company. And so we're going to need to build relationships with third parties where we can tap into those resources and make them stakeholders in our success. And, you know, in terms of metabolizing those results, again, it comes back down to relationships. It's building relationships with the SMEs of the equipment that we're monitoring, and then building relationships with the vendors that built it, making sure those design standards get changed, you know, those kinds of things, which is also a slow process.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that a little bit. I like the go slow, one person at a time for the front office scenarios that I talked about. For the back office, middle office, how you kind of ingest, manage, govern, ensure the quality of, and, you know, correlate and aggregate data for warehousing purposes to make it available. I think you can be successful with that with enterprise solutions and enterprise processes. You don't want to leave the end consumers to have to spend a lot of time hunting and gathering for data and correlating it and scrubbing it themselves. You want to give them data that is ready for them to consume and experiment with and use. So, you know, I'll just add on to Kevin's comments. I think the back office, middle office, you know, definitely pursue enterprise, and at AEP, we're definitely looking at that from a data maturity focus as well. I'll plus one on leveraging third parties, because other industries, you know, financial services, marketing, you know, they've been, you know, really good at leveraging data and aggregating data for a long time. I think utilities to use data outside of operational purposes are catching up, but there's a lot of expertise out there to help us. So, you know, definitely leverage third parties where you can. And then on the how do you change organizational procedures to weave new asset management expectations into operations processes? You know, another great question. With the increase in growth of smart devices on the grid, you have to be able to inventory those. You have to know where those assets are at and be able to manage them. So we're investing in tools that will help us automatically discover and automatically populate, you know, what we refer to as, you know, your CMDB, your configuration management database, so that we know where those devices are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, Juan.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I joined in the middle due to other commitment. There was my PhD student was defending, and we couldn't do it. So, but I have two questions actually. One is, as the data grows, you know, more and more of it is becoming available either within the utility or from outside. Do you see a moment that is maybe closer rather than further away in time, when your storage capabilities, data storage capabilities, and your computational capabilities maybe that are resident within your perimeter of the company, that they may choke up, which leads to follow-on question: if that's the case, or it will be the case soon, what are your options that you're looking at? So that would be on that side. We all know that if we look at the data analytics, the historical data matters, which means it's not anymore just grabbing data from yesterday to project for tomorrow. It's grabbing data for the last 10 years or whatever is available to have better predictions, for example. So that's one question. The other question is maybe kind of a tie to this one, is how do you see the legacy solutions that you're using today extensively, EMS, ADMS, synchrophasers, various types of sensors, substation equipment, and so on. How do you see that needing a change in the design as we move forward? Now, you don't change these systems every year, or not even every 10 years, but nevertheless, they are updated and changed once in a while. Do you see the need for the community, professional community, vendors, and so on, to start providing certain features in these designs that will facilitate data analytics steps, processing, ingestion, curation, data quality, whatever you want to call it, whatever steps are there? So those are the two questions that I have. And the reason I'm asking them is because, DOE has, as you know, many labs, and there are a lot of people out there doing work. And a lot of them are looking into some of these aspects. So the question is, whether there is a sync between utilities thinking that these issues are important and DOE over here, in the labs, kind of doing the things that may help. So that's the background of my two questions.
Well, Mladen, I think the first one is easy. The short answer is take a cloud-first approach to these kind of transformations. With what I know now, I would never try to build an environment or an ecosystem for my data analytics team that wasn't built on cloud infrastructure, and preferably with some third-party support. Like, I wouldn't want to roll my own AWS infrastructure. You don't want to mess with that kind. And a lot of people do try to mess with that kind of stuff. But get a partner that can provide you with access to cloud resources and just go headfirst into that. Maybe someone else can take the second question.
Well, just maybe Kevin, I agree with you. Cloud's going to help with that because it's just because of the dynamic nature and how you can scale. But fundamentally, Mladen, it's a cost question. So, storage is just dollars, at a reduced rate at cloud or at a very expensive rate on-prem. But as long as the benefits that we're producing makes the case for that storage to be worth it, then we will be doing this. If the benefits are not there, why increasing your storage if neither the customer nor the shareholders will benefit from that investment? So I think there's with all of that, it goes back to we can invest in these technologies as long as we're producing the insights that are producing value on the customer or the shareholder side.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'll also add that there is, and this talks to the workforce people skill plus process maturity around, a concept called data lifecycle management. And I'll go back to the AMI example. When we started deploying AMI, we kept 15-minute interval reads, forever. And after a certain period of time, you don't need 15-minute granularity. Maybe after 6 months, you can aggregate that up to hourly. And after 2 years, you can aggregate it up, even further. And same thing with some of the sensor data and image data that we're getting from drones that we're deploying. You can take a a 15-minute video snippet, and there may only be 30 seconds of valuable content in there. If you can, create a process that strips out the stuff that doesn't matter, process that, 30 seconds of valuable data, and then throw it away a month later after you don't need it, you can also help manage, whether it's on-prem or cloud, it doesn't matter. You still need to put good data lifecycle management practices around, how you're dealing with this increasing growth of data. And then on the other question on legacy solutions, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, as we're exploring how to use, PMU data to replace SCADA data for real-time scenario planning, for our transmission SCADA systems and state estimation type of use cases, we're working with a third party to evolve the EMS type of solutions to be able to deal with that large volume of data to produce those types of real-time outcomes.
I can add one more thing to the storage question. If you move into more flexible computing infrastructure, then there are ways that you can leverage tiered storage systems, particularly if you have an intelligence layer over top of it. So if you don't know whether something will be valuable in the future, but you think that it might, there are storage solutions whose access speeds are just a little bit slower or maybe a lot slower that come at orders of magnitudes lower cost. So it basically becomes noise in terms of your cost driver. And so that way you can save it, and if you need to rehydrate it later, you can. And so that's another reason why I'd suggest, going to the cloud is you have much more flexibility in terms of managing the cost because you have more options in terms of storage and compute and all these things.
Thank you very much. Next up is Dave Morrison.
Thank you. After the answer to the last question, I now have two questions. The one in response to what I've just heard is around cybersecurity concerns and the cloud-based approach. Are there things that you aren't willing to put on the cloud? Are there things that you need to do with respect to the third parties out of cybersecurity concerns, given how much potentially sensitive data you've got there? The starting question was, to what degree are the kinds of projects in which the three speakers are engaging scalable? At what size utility does it start to become responsible? How many customers do you have to have? How much revenue do you have to have? How many staff do you need to have for there to be an ROI on these kinds of projects? Thank you.
That was a lot of questions. So I think the cybersecurity thing I'll address very, very tersely because I'm not an expert, though I've lived through that transformation to more of a cloud-first approach. Really, the resources are there for us to be as secure, if not more secure, in the cloud than we are on-prem. And yes, there are a lot of details that go into that, but there are no fundamental blockers to it. It's just a matter of doing the things the way that your company needs to do them to feel secure, to meet whatever standards or compliance requirements are involved. We do have some things that at present day we do not put in the cloud, but I don't see any of those things as immutable. I perceive that changing over time. And in terms of, it would be hard to speak to the size of the utility question, but in terms of staffing, I think the absolute minimum number of humans to do what we're doing is probably 2 or 3. And by the end of next year, I'll have 6. And I could probably triple that and still keep them all occupied. But the absolute minimum number is probably 2 because the use cases and the data types are bounded in our work. Now, if you started going at the scale of Encore or AEP, the with the way that they're looking at data, it's much less bounded, and so they might be able to speak to that better than I can.
And that maybe on the last part of the question, I'd chime in here. You know, Jay, maybe a better way to look at it is rather than something additional that we do and an additional staff or group, even though many of us may do that in order to have some focus to develop big data analytics. But, you know, in the long run, I really think, and we're trying to do that today already, this is not so much an additional staffing need or creating a new department of data analytics. It's how to embed these technologies, these skills and tool sets into what we do every day. How does a utility planning department utilize Spark and Python to produce better planning products, a better plan for the grid, or a grid operations group like my group? I have 5, 6 engineers in the back office that are analyzing, doing root cause analysis, analyzing weak spots on the grid. How do they utilize big data analytics technologies in their day-to-day work? Just like, you know, whatever, 20, 30 years ago, we all started using Excel spreadsheets all of a sudden and not, you know, the paperwork anymore. And so I see that being more embedded in the existing workforce than necessarily a staffing need that is, you know, additional to what we have today.
Yeah, you know, adding on to that, on the ROI question, you know, I think from my perspective, it's the it depends answer, and you know, it depends on the use case. I mean, in some of our early AMI energy theft use cases, you know, we were able to identify enough value that paid for our analytics costs, you know, for a couple of years in advance. So, you know, you do have to look at the individual use cases and the value that comes out of it, and see how you can fund putting that together. And to Hagen's point, I mean, this is pretty much, you know, I think it is a core competency going forward that we as an industry just need to, you know, make sure it's in place, because it's good with the amount of data and how we're trying to drive industry transformation, leveraging technology and data. You know, it's something that, you know, that we all just need to have. On the cybersecurity question, you know, the answer, yes, there are things we won't put in the cloud. Agree with Kevin, it's going to change over time as people get more and more comfortable with putting the controls around, you know, those types of solutions. You know, I think it will go away, but currently today, I know we're not there yet.
Thank you, everyone. I have next Bob Cummings, followed by Darlene.
Greg, Hagen, and Kevin, it's very, very good discussion. I just have some comments. I think one of the things about sources for analytics, I think the North American Synchrophaser Initiative probably has a library of some of the current stuff that might be available. I'm not sure they have much on the distribution side of all of this, the meter side, but there are some things out there, particularly in the Western interconnection, for wide area use of phaser measurements. As far as PMUs go, if you think big data is big now, we're finding in the inverter-based resource analyses, you need point-on-wave data. Now, you don't need to stream point-on-wave data for all of these items, but you do need it to analyze what the heck's happening in the quarter cycle time frame that inverters operate in. And it also, the scope of observability that's necessary to reap even more benefits is at the interconnection level, meaning you need to go from Maine to Miami and from Saskatchewan to Texas in order to see things like forced oscillations that we had in January of 2018. So the observability is important, especially as we go forward with more and more inverters on the system. I think Kevin brought it up about the potential for interaction between control systems. It's a real big bugaboo. Seeing a lot of it in ERCOT these days, and it's certainly going to be a growing problem. So understanding inverters and how they might interact on a controls level is really going to be a very, very large growing aspect of this. And to do that analysis, you are going to need point-on-wave data from the inverter fleet. Not every inverter, but you have to have a good enough sample to be able to see into that world. So just some observations and things from having played with this way too long. Thank you.
Bob, I just want to share that, excuse me, you're 100% right. We've seen it already. We rely on basically some waveform captures, some like scheduled waveform captures from our DFR devices to be able to be more diagnostic in our research. And it's not just the inverters, it's actually our spinning metal too. Yeah. There are things that we see that we're clearly not able to observe with the frequency spectrum we can see with synchrophasers, and so we have to go deeper. And you're right, it doesn't need to stream, but you got to have something there to sample for maybe minutes or hours, and then do your analysis accordingly. But yeah, it's the synchrophasers end up being a really great screening method and are really great for that fixed part of the frequency spectrum, but you absolutely have to have it at some point.
And I've always found that you don't just look at one media. You don't look at just frequency. Look at frequency, voltage, and current worlds, and you could learn a lot more.
Completely agree.
Any other discussion on this topic? Who's up next, Chris?
Yeah, so up next we have Darlene.
Good afternoon. This has been a really good discussion so far. So I just have two quick questions. The first one is for Greg. You had mentioned during your presentation the challenge with the value proposition for continued work on deployment as well as, kind of utilization of PMUs. Just want to get your thoughts on, have you been able to develop a solid value proposition, one that folks can, stakeholders can kind of wrap their arms around? We're struggling with this a little bit at PJM as we try to incorporate PMU deployment into some of our regional transmission planning processes. The second one is general for anyone, and that is around data management. A lot of folks have mentioned the challenges with, retaining this much data, manipulating this much data, using it in analytics. I'm wondering, have you been able to advance your data retention policies to try to mitigate some of that?
So on the question on value from PMU data, a lot of the discussion that we had internally at AEP on that topic was really around the real time, capture, transport, ingestion, and use for, as a replacement for SCADA for, state estimation and managing the transmission grid. And so, we certainly haven't solved that yet. We are, in the middle of several investments in order to be able to leverage that data in real time. I mentioned we're about halfway through, I think, building out 40,000 line miles of fiber network along our transmission system in order to be able to capture that data and to be able to make it available for real-time use, because it is pretty dense data, large volumes of data, and we need the network to be able to bring that back. And then I also referred to some work that we're doing with a third party on developing, the real-time state estimation, EMS ability to ingest that data and to leverage it in real time. Now, using that data in a sample form or, using it other kind of non-real-time use cases, I believe we are making good progress there. But it does speak to your second question about data management and data retention. And, you know, I know at AEP we're not as mature as we need to be there. That's what I referred to earlier as the back office capabilities. You know, we get a lot of, you know, well, how long do you need to keep the data? What data do you need to keep? When the answer is, well, I need to keep it all forever. And we know that's not the case, but we do need to increase our maturity in policy and process in order to make sure that we can ask the right questions up front, that we can really drive into, you know, what is the life cycle of the data and, you know, how can we manage that better? So I know that's something that we're investing in right now to get better at.
Maybe just one point I would like to add to Greg's data management answer. I think the data retention and how much and how long data should be stored or replicated, you know, that's, I think for most organizations, fairly straightforward, and I hope mostly driven by the stakeholder needs and the value that that data may represent. So I'm not actually too worried about it. You know, that is an ongoing conversation. I think the bigger challenge what we face is once you are storing the original data or replicating it for data analytics, then you're using it in for all different kinds of use cases and purposes. You start using it in a BI reporting environment. You're using it to develop new use cases with AI. You start using it to support new insights and feed-ins through APIs in your operational systems. So there's this multitude of analytics use cases, you know, maybe hundreds of them, and they all have data needs, and the data need to be structured different. And then you end up doing copies of copies of copies. And so at some point, each organization has to really think through how to virtualize your data. So how to organize your data store, because there's not really that one magic copy where everybody is tapping and putting their fingers into. It becomes a very complex architecture, how these data with short tables, long tables, supporting all these different use cases and applications, that is a living monster in itself, and you know, some kind of virtualization, some kind of organization that has to be applied to not let that go out of hand, I suppose.
Okay, thank you.
So the next three members of the question are Tom Bialik, then Delia, and then Joy.
Yeah, so this is Tom. So the question for all of you is, you know, DOEs try to understand how to, you know, what they can provide or what the needs are and how can they assist the industry. So if you were to go to DOE and say, I've got data and I've got information, what is it that you would want DOE to do? What do you see as gaps that where you could leverage the labs or, you know, have them provide value for you and your environment?
I can take a stab at it. Generally speaking, Tom, it comes down to people and skills. In the scope of our work, and again, it's not as all-encompassing as the other two panelists, but in the scope of our work, we are not bounded by data. We are not bounded by technology. We are not bounded by ideas. We are bounded by our ability to execute on all of our ideas and to metabolize those results back into the system somewhere. So in my perfect world, the DOE helps us create sort of a virtual team of people where we have mutual incentives for people with skills that we can't hire at Dominion to work on Dominion data with Dominion problems and do so in a very secure, safe, robust, but also like low cost and streamlined way. So imagine I have my data analytics platform in the cloud, and all I have to do is grant secure access to particular personnel in the research labs, and somehow their funding is directed towards helping us solve our problems. Now, I'm being specific here about Dominion, but you could certainly abstract that notion out to a larger team or a larger set of companies. But just that notion of like, if we really are going to collaborate at scale, it's got to be very easy to do it, and there's going to have to be some more direct sharing of ideas and data. And that's the complex answer. The simple answer is if there was some way to incentivize people to pick up these skills as they join the workforce, or a way to incentivize new companies, startups, services, products, technologies, whatever, to exist in our ecosystem such that we can tap into them as partners and collaborators.
Yeah, in a similar way, I would share, I would, in an ideal world, Tom, I would hope or think of DOE kind of as an accelerator in this data analytics evolution and learning curve that we all travel on. So right now, we're having the two extreme bookends. On one side, we're very application focused and really trying to produce value with our use case for customers or, the reliability of the system. On the other side, you have the open source community and the Googles and all the data science community at large in our society, in our country, producing deep learning algorithms, machine learning, AI stuff, and to connect that really, really basic research or that basic data science that is being developed with our specific circumstances and issues that we have in the utility. There's a big gap in between, right? So our people looking out there for what data science insights have been produced and how to translate that to our data sets, to our situations, to our use cases. And that takes a lot of time, and each utility is doing it on their own, producing their own, how many different load forecast algorithms based on AMS data are out there? and how many different ways do you do image analytics, using TensorFlow or Caffe framework, all those different things, and everybody is trying to. So I could really see DOE doing some basic research saying, here is, if you have a 1 year forecast, you go about it differently. If you have a 1 hour forecast based on AMS versus substation data, how do these technologies could be applied or even compared, to accelerate that application where we can take a data science concept to producing a new insight that changes a process or decision in the utility. That acceleration enabler, I would, share that from my perspective.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. If the DOE could assist in proving the value of owning the skills in core utilities operations functions, I think the skills exist in the world, in other industries, Google, Amazon, financial services. They are expensive specialist skills, and I haven't seen utilities necessarily hire it outside of a central technology or innovation or, data science function. Maybe in some niche engineering specializations they exist, but at a larger scale, in order to grow the skill in our industry, I think there is going to need to be some more proof that it's valuable and we need it. On other areas where the DOE, I think, can help, I talked about a little bit earlier, promote or encourage standards and interoperability. We've leveraged the Common Information Model, IEC 61968, 61970, DNP, making sure that all the, manufacturers of devices are, using data formats and standards that will help and promote interoperability. And then the third thing I talked about a lot is just networking capacity requirements. And, again, it's an expensive investment. You can't start building your network capacity too soon. You can't underbuild it, in my opinion, but maybe helping utilities and helping the industry understand what networking capacity requirements are associated with certain desired features and use cases. I think that would help people to, maybe time or prioritize their investment in some of those capabilities.
I want to bring up one specific example that crossed my mind. When we did that vegetation management use case, where we identified trees in the right of way, and that's we did that for the Encore system. But I recognize if you go to Google Earth, you have objects identified on satellite imagery where the restaurants are, where the streets are, because there's a lot of use for that, and it has economic value for the society, and therefore Google put that on there. There are no structured objects of interest for utilities. Trees in the right-of-way, nobody cares about it other than utilities. The scale is not large enough for those type of companies that produce these platforms to produce utility-specific structured data rather than just an image that is out there. And so, but every utility has to do that. So, what if a research entity can actually say, hey, we have an algorithm where we can on a national scale identify objects of interest for utilities, or things like that, where that can be a synergy and leveraged across multiple entities rather than everybody having to make that investment in terms of resources and efforts themselves.
Thank you very much. So full disclosure, Kevin needs to leave at 2 o'clock, but that's about the time we're going to end this particular session at 2. We do have 2 other people. Delia had already said that Tom Bialik asked her question. So we have Joy Ditto from APPA and Dave Herlong from Florida Power and Light.
Hey, this is a great discussion. And in my previous role as CEO of the Utilities Technology Council, I had you all as my members. And some of you mentioned, I think, Greg, you just talked about the need for kind of robust telecommunications networks in this environment where you then use that to derive robust data, or at least real-time data in certain situations. Not in every case do you need it in real time, but certainly from an operational standpoint. And I think one of you mentioned really laying fiber and kind of building out your network, your private network from that standpoint with the wires side, as I think this is sort of more of a kind of a statement, but I'm happy to have reactions from the panel as well. But as many of you all know, on the wireless side, you need spectrum, and our spectrum policy has been very geared toward kind of traditional telecommunications providers, and in some part toward sort of the new technology kind of companies as well, really to the detriment of electric utilities and other critical infrastructure providers. And in my view, that is a huge problem because fiber is expensive, and it's particularly expensive when you're talking about more remote and rural areas. And if you can't, derive data kind of wherever you are, no matter what the geography is, it's a problem. And again, some of the policies we've seen come out of the Federal Communications Commission, regardless of administration, this is not a political statement, has been very problematic for critical infrastructure. And I think that's done up in the policy side is really where we need some help from DOE. So there's sort of this, so I wanted to throw that out there to see if you all agreed with that concern and sort of that importance, and just sort of flag it for this group as well.
Yeah, we've talked about that internally, and, just rhetorically, should there be something like a FirstNet for electric utilities, just kind of a public or, a private network for our own use. The conversation about wireless within our service territory. So we have 250,000 square miles of service territory. Our 2 biggest cities are Columbus, Ohio, and maybe Tulsa, Oklahoma. So the majority of our service territory is rural, so we don't get a lot of commercial wireless coverage for our field crews. So building out our own private fiber network is pretty important for us to be able to do what you just talked about, being able to get the data if you can't derive the data from your service territory, then that's a problem, right? So we're trying to solve that ourselves. So it does depend on your service territory and what's commercially available from a communications capability. But I would certainly support your premise that some policy support around making sure that utilities do have the capabilities to get the data that they need would be helpful.
Thank you.
All right, Chris,
finally,
how are we doing on the questions?
Like I said, we only have one more person in the queue right now, with time permitting, is Dave Herlong from Florida Power and Light.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'll be brief. Great presentation. It's just really great. I guess my answer to the question about how the DOE can help is, if I go back 20 years, many of us across the IOU field were, kind of dabbling in digital relays and digitization of substations and automatic switching in the distribution side of the house. And it really took until some of the DOE funding and grants to accelerate that, the 2008, 2010 time period. And that was sort of a hardware to lift, right, and a digitization piece. And it sort of feels like now, we're in different scales, but, call it several years to a decade into the data ocean that's coming in. And we're all trying to figure out how to use all the data and benefit our customers. And I do wonder if the DOE's got a place in having that same approach in somehow incenting new players in technology, incenting the current software space, the folks that maybe aren't in the space today to collaborate better, to incent them to work on algorithms and improvements. Us as an industry doing it all separately, I think, has some benefit, but doing it more collectively and having experts in the field that can go proliferate the use of those algorithms for reliability reasons, for efficiency reasons, it could all be very beneficial. And I almost see it like a second wave of influence that moved from the hardware side, over a decade ago, now to the application logic, algorithm, machine learning space. Just some feedback.
I couldn't agree more with you, Dave. That is a very good thought. To leverage that intellectual knowledge that is out there, from outsiders, rather than just thinking about our own industry and the usual suspects, what they can produce.
Yeah, I agree. I think we try to do that today using things like EPRI and, funding EPRI programs collaboratively to drive some of those things forward. But I think outside industry information would also be helpful.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of running on the end of our time allotment here for the first panel. Joe, I recommend we take a 10-minute break. Is that all right with you?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, I really want to thank the panelists. This has been a great discussion, wonderful material. So Greg, Kevin, Hagen, thank you so much for your contributions here and preparation. Thank you. We'll come back here in 10 more minutes.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Yep.
Go ahead, Chris. What were you going to say?
Hey, Joe, take it away. I mean, just to make sure the rest of your panelists are here.
Okay. Are you seeing them?
So I see Suresh, obviously. Who are the other two panelists?
So we have in this next panel session, again, we're having a discussion of utilities on big data. We have Suresh Jati from ISO New England, Bill Kelly from hold on, something just happened here. Bill Kelly from Austin Energy, and David Pinney from the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association.
We have the two of those gentlemen on as well. So yeah, you're all set, Joe.
Okay, that's great, and I want to thank those gentlemen for being here, and I'll have them come up and speak very shortly. I did again to level set for those folks who were not in the prior session or who came in late. This is our third session on big data, and we've sent materials out that provides information on the prior two sessions. There's great information there. What we really want to do is get a utility perspective on big data and what their issues are around it. And we'll get into details, obviously, in the course of these presentations. If you just show the first slide, Matt, again, I just want to show this slide one more time. Again, big data is a huge subject, and this slide attempts to really compartmentalize different aspects of it. There are applications and functions along the right side, and these functions require data in different time scales. And it's really important to be able to associate function with data requirements, with time scale, and what kind of analytics needs to happen in between the data gathering and the function. And this diagram attempts to really kind of like build that out and then show some detail around it. Again, latency of data, how quickly do we need to get it to a specific function or application is a primary consideration in how we start thinking about managing big data. Next slide, please. And obviously in this problem statement, we're seeing an explosion of data, but we also have to increase observability of the system. We know that big data provides invaluable information in a lot of different ways to utilities and to also improve the customer experience. There are a lot of practical issues that we're going to be getting into associated with big data. And the major question is really, as we have to build out our capabilities, our skills, our decision-making tools, the infrastructure needed to manage data and visualize data, what's the value proposition in that for us to rationalize the investments and rationalize the effort, and what technological institutional hurdles do we really need to address to realize this value? And then the last slide. Matt, thank you. So there were a lot of questions that we presented to the panelists, and what we attempted to do here was roll them up, and we presented this also to the panelists. And again, what we're really trying to do in these within this next 2 hours is with the insights provided from the panelists, information gained from them, is what data analytics has your company, firm developed, organization developed? What value have you seen from undertaking that? Secondly, what do you see as factors limiting further and deeper development of data analytics? And then finally, and one of the major focuses of this panel session is where should DOE and the national labs focus efforts to enable the industry to better gather and utilize data? And we have programs around data analytics. Items A through D are things that we're working on already in those programs, developing sensors, developing and trying to demonstrate sensing and communications platforms that are scalable and improve interoperability. We talked a little bit about that in the last session and the importance of that. Developing visualization technologies to improve situational awareness of the system, looking at observing renewables and DERs in real time, what the grid state is, being able to monitor ambient conditions and factor that into our decision-making processes. And fourthly, they're developing standards and best practices to be able to deal with data acquisition, sharing data across systems, and what kind of analytical methods could we actually develop. There probably should be another item, an E item there that really sort of stood out in the last session. And that has to do with assembling subject matter experts to be able to address real utility issues and what kind of algorithms can be done and developed and shared across the industry to do that, so that common issues that utilities are facing with respect to applying data. Perhaps there's a set of folks from the labs and subject matter experts that can actually come together sort of in a data analytics team and work with utilities to develop common practices to be able to address those. So I'll leave it at that. And what I would like to do next is to introduce our first speaker, who is Suresh Jati. I hope I got your last name pronounced correctly there, Suresh.
You got it, Jeff.
Thank you. And Suresh is the Director of Database and Enterprise Support Services at ISO New England. He's responsible for a number of functions there, including the Enterprise Data Warehouse and developing business intelligence and data analysis solutions. He's responsible for enterprise architecture, and data governance, and in the development of internal and external facing enterprise applications. So Suresh, the way we're doing this is we're not giving the speakers a lot of time. We could be talking for the next day, obviously, on all of this, but we would love you to be able to hold your presentations to about 10 minutes, and then we'll have maybe a question that we can entertain to elucidate a specific issue. And then at the end of all the presentations, we're going to have an hour's open Q&A session. So if you wouldn't mind, Suresh, to begin, and we'll let you know when you're around 10 minutes. And if you wouldn't mind starting, that'd be great.
Just real quick, this is Matt, before beginning. A heads up, would people just be able to please put their hands down? And then once the presentation is over, we'll do it again. If you have a clarifying question, to put your hand up, and we can ask one or two questions just to have that process. So, yeah, thank you. Suresh, go for it.
Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone, at least for the folks on the East Coast. Just want to check to make sure everybody is able to hear me okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction and moderating the panel. So far, we had great presentations and talks so far from Greg Filipkowski, Kevin Jones, and Hagen Hench. And then we had, it looks like, very really engaging discussion right after that. This is the first time for me on the panel. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to share and contribute on this panel. I'll be talking a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in the data analytics area, especially in the synchrophase and PMU data area at ISO New England. Next slide, please. Okay, I think it looks like most of you are probably already familiar with the synchrophaser. I'm going to go back. Matt, thank you, Matt. I won't spend too much time on this slide. This looks like most of you are already familiar with the synchrophasers and PMUs. Obviously, the big difference is the synchrophaser, as opposed to the SCADA, you get phase angle measurements, oscillations, and with the GPS synchronized. And the other big deal is the high sampling rate, where you get 30 to 120 measurements per second, as opposed to one measurement every 3 to 4 seconds in the current SCADA system. So that's the key of synchrophaser. Obviously, the PMUs provide these measurements. And that's the new thing. It's been like the last 10 years. Obviously, that's where the explosion of the data is really coming from. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, here it just gives a little example of the value the PMU data and synchrophaser data really comes in. This is a graph that shows an example of just a 3-minute period. The blue line is the one where the data was collected using the SCADA system, where we're collecting the measurements every 3 to 4 seconds. And those orange wave lines is the data collected from the synchrophasers, really, where you can see the oscillations there and the variations. In a matter of 3 minutes, you can see the peak-to-peak variation nearly 100 megawatts. And this kind of a disturbance, it would not have been caught in the current system. And if this lasted longer than that, that could have had a serious repercussions where it could have caused the reliability issues on the grid itself. So that's the value, obviously, synchrophase and PMU data brings in. And this is a similar thing that has caused that WECC blackout a few years ago. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, just this is slide talks about a little bit how we really got started. Obviously, most other folks who talked about the PMU and the C2 like synchrophaser data. So this is a project that got started back in 2010. This was from the DOE funding. Thanks to the DOE, this is how we got started. This is a project that got us the PMUs installed in the field, and the implementation period was that 2010 to 2013, and followed by 2 years of observation period. And then we really that launched us into the moving into the actual implementation of applications. And what we ended up doing at New England is we made changes to the operating procedure 22 so that we can really adapt this thing. We needed procedural changes to make this really happen. Now it should no longer be a proof of concept or research. We really wanted to see this in action. So these changes, when we made the operating procedure 22 changes, we required all new 345 kV stations or any changes to the existing station. We required them to install the PMUs. And also the other TO locations that are designated by the ISO mainly for monitoring the system operating limits, those are also, we required them to install the PMUs so that we can kind of start collecting the data. These changes really, we expect to have double the number of PMUs in the field because of these changes in the OP22. Thank you. Next slide, please. So here just gives a high-level overview, pictorial view of what we have, the infrastructure out in the field. At the bottom right, you can see we have PMUs installed in 49 substations, 92 PMUs, and 425 phases installed in the field. And top left there, you can see we also have interchanges, data exchanges set up with the New York ISO, PJM, and MISO through EIDSN framework. On the top right-hand side, you see some of the internal applications we have developed that utilize the PMU data for our use. Next slide, please. So these are kind of the applications we currently have in production at ISO New England that uses PMU data. And I won't get into all the applications. I'll just at least touch a few of the applications to just get a feel for it. The first one is the OpenPDC. This is the Phaser Data Concentrator project. This is really the foundational application that really got us going. This application was came from the open source project that was sponsored by the DOE that uses IEEE real-time streaming protocol to stream the PMU data. And this PDC aggregates the New England as well as our external areas PMU data, and then sends as a one concentrated stream, one concentrated data stream to the downstream applications so that they can start utilizing this data for analytics or post-event analysis and the troubleshooting. So that's really the main application that really got us going. And the next application I want to touch a little bit is, can you go back to the previous slide? I'll just touch a couple more things. Thank you. And one other application I want to touch there is oscillation source location. This is an in-house developed application that we use to identify any undamped oscillations so that our operators can use the information to take any mitigation actions. And also this application sends alarm emails to our control room supervisors, support engineers, as well as the local control centers, and then eventually to the actual generating power plants too, where these signals are getting generated. So that's really took it to the next level so that all the affected parties are really communicated. One other application I want to touch is the Phaser Analytics. That's the last application on the list out there. This is an offline application. We worked with the GE who is our primary vendor, to do a post-event analysis. This application really brings multiple data sources together, like PMU data, SCADA data, DFR, the digital fault recorder data, and simulation data. This brings all the data together, loads into the memory, and uses some algorithms and statistics to do the post-event analysis. And this can analyze as much as 1 year PMU data as it stands right now. Obviously, the more PMU get installed, the data volume would explode. But right now, we can analyze 1 year worth of data in this. Next slide, please. So here, this is just gives a view of the applications that are in various stages right now. Some of them we've been running in our test environment for some time. Some of them we have done a proof of concept. So these are what we call as the future applications. The first one is with an application that's going to go live next year. This is the Pi Historian repository we're developing for PMU data. Because the current PDC, it can store the PMU data, but I don't think it can scale well when we add more PMUs, as well as we keep adding more historical data. The current system cannot handle the performance, so that's why we're working on moving this PMU data into Pi Historian repository. And also, just talking about some of the ongoing research. We have a business architecture and technology team closely works with the universities as well as the local utility companies and our business units to do the research in multiple areas. And one of the things we're looking at is the data storage technologies that we are currently working with the GE to test various data storage technologies. They're looking at the products which are available already in the market, things like Timescale DB, Cassandra, and Influx, and it looks like Timescale DB is the one which they choose that looks like a good fit for the scalability. That's what's going to go forward. We'll be looking at that. And the other thing is the cybersecurity. Obviously, we talked about a lot. That's a big deal. Cyber attackers can alter the SCADA measurements themselves by using the fault data injection attacks. So having a PMU data as an independent and parallel infrastructure, we are planning to leverage that to monitor the SCADA measurements and any compromises that may happen in that, so that we can have an early warning in that. So to just follow up on the cybersecurity, I know in the previous panel discussion, there is a question brought up about putting the PMU or other data in the cloud itself. Do we have any concerns? I just want to add to that a little bit. We had a good discussion on that. I personally believe that we can design the cloud environment to be as secure, if not more secure, than on-premise platform. This really what involves is you have a good network design involved in the overall design of the cloud infrastructure that will really enable us to have a really secure environment in the cloud. That's the end of the presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Suresh. Really appreciate that. Are there any questions? Okay. Again, Suresh, thanks very much. Don't go away. We're going to have a big Q&A session. I'd like to now introduce Bill Kelly, who's a Distribution Process Manager, Advanced Technology at Austin Energy. His Advanced Grid Technology group covers areas such as advanced metering systems and engineering, distribution asset management, distributed energy resource integration, and implementing enterprise technology software for engineering as well as field operations. Bill, would you mind proceeding?
Absolutely, Joe. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
All right, great. And let me know when you can see my screen, if you would.
It's up.
All right, great. Well, first and foremost, thanks for the opportunity to come and present and talk and discuss. I certainly enjoyed the first session immensely, and all the questions. I took a little bit of a different tact when developing a topic to discuss. Certainly, we could discuss our AMI implementation, our recent implementation of the SHINES project, a DOE-funded opportunity for us to implement grid-scale storage and a DERMS, and talk about the data that we're actually gathering and investigating there. What I wanted to talk about instead was a specific example where someone like an Austin Energy or any utility really is impacted by environmental factors and our ability to respond to those environmental factors in near real time. And what I'm talking about are wildfire events. So I wanted to go through some of the stuff we're doing from an asset management perspective, some of the data that we're actually pulling in, and some of the challenges that we're having getting predictive analytics versus actual, after the fact analytics, and what impact that might have on our ability to react to a situation when it's already underway. So I know we're time constrained. I'm going to go through some of this relatively quickly. Just a little slide on Austin Energy. We are a municipally owned utility. We're vertically integrated in a deregulated market, so we own generation all the way down to the customer experience. We're a very dense service territory of about 437 square miles, and we have roughly 500,000 customers, and we are fully AMI deployed. My background is in AMI. I came up in the industry, or the utility in AMI, from our first AMR implementation all the way through. Now we are fully AMI deployed, and we have a lot of good stories, great stories to tell on that data, and a lot of hardships we have on data aggregation, data warehousing, cloud versus on-prem storage, things of that nature. But what we can do is touch on a little bit of that, but the example I'm going to go into is predictive analytics. So what are our challenges? Predictive analytics is certainly one of them when it comes to wildfire mitigation and wildfire risk. Identifying faults before they happen on the distribution system is something we are very much engaged in right now, and I'll go into that in just a second. Cybersecurity, we own generation all the way down to the customer. So internal cybersecurity is certainly one thing and one aspect of what we need to look for, but more and more our customers are looking for us to provide them real-time information, even down to the meter level, pairing a meter with a home energy management system. So now we're talking about implementing and integrating opportunities for customers to pair with meters their home energy management systems, and then now you're introducing a whole level of complexity around a cybersecurity perspective of allowing customers to gain access to some of your distribution sensors, essentially is what our AMI meters are these days. Interoperability is another big factor. We had a lot of discussion earlier, which I was glad to hear, about AMI and SIM and moving towards those open standard models of interoperability. We have certainly some use cases on our early distribution energy resource optimizer integration from our grid scale energy storage systems that tell a little bit of a different story, a very young industry, a very young technology where we're struggling to forecast how we're going to implement these things in an open standards perspective when open standards there aren't exactly adopted as they are other places. But again, the real example that I wanted to go over and discuss some of the challenges that we have are not the volumes of data that we get in. We are a data-rich utility. We are I would say nearly data poor or asset poor utility in the size that we have. We don't have a centralized enterprise repository as of now. We're moving in the direction of doing so, but we don't. What we have is a bunch of disparate systems, and we need to pair all that data together. And so one great example of how that is hindering some of the things that we're doing is wildfire risk mitigation. So the map you're looking at right now, Malad will be happy to know that we're going to be talking about Texas A&M a little bit in here, as he's in Texas A&M. That star is Austin, and if you can't see, all those little red speckled dots around Austin are your risk mitigation areas. This is a map that was provided by Texas A&M on some of the highest hotspot areas in the state of Texas, and Austin is right on the cusp of some of those hottest hotspot areas. A good example of that is in 2011, we had a series of fires in Bastrop County, which is right next to Austin. It was one of the hottest 2-month, 3-month periods on record. There were severe drought conditions, and there was a significant fire that burned roughly 58 to 6,000 acres, 4 deaths, and about 1,600 homes were lost as well. The ignition source was a suspected down power line. This was not in Austin Energy Service territory. I need to use this. We're using this as an example of what potentially we're concerned about could happen in the Austin service territory. And this is our wildfire risk mitigation map. And so what we've taken here is information from Austin Fire Department, the City of Austin, and Austin Energy, our GIS data sources, and pushed them together, overlaid our service territory onto this map to understand where our feeders are and which ones touch the biggest, highest risk feeders that we have. We don't have data coming directly from these feeders to tell us which assets out there are the oldest, which assets out there are showing signs of degradation, which ones might be arcing. We only have to rely on the sensors, maybe a line sensor in the field, and all the information we have on the substation. And even then, those little nuanced, abnormalities aren't going to be seen at a granular level for us to be able to do something with it. So what we're doing is cobbling together all of this information and then predicting these are feeders that might be in these specific areas. Feeders stretch across different zones as well, so they may not be comprehensive that we might have a problem in a high-risk area that starts in a low-risk area. One of the things we did do with Texas A&M, and we started this back in about 2016, 2017. We were at the time one of 7 utilities participating in a project that has now grown to even PG&E, I believe, is if they haven't already installed them, they're looking at them, the distribution fault anticipation waveform analyzers. This is something that you put at the beginning of the feeder, and we start to get information back in from a waveform perspective that should be able to tell you or is intended to tell us when we may have an arcing situation or something that might lead to a fault on the line itself. Through machine learning and continuous feedback of information back to Texas A&M, we're continuing to refine the data that's coming in. And it does have the ability to at least narrow down, if not relatively pinpoint, based upon the waveform where this fault may be occurring or potentially occur. So right now, again, fault locations, down live conductors, which are obviously significant events, conductor slaps and crash, equipment arcing or explosions, trees or vegetation leaning into a feeder. These are all things that we need to take a look at. However, they're all in arrears, right? That's historical information that we get in currently that we want to go take a look. Why did a fault happen? What we want to do is get in front of that. We want to get in front of it with the information that we're aggregating and getting in, and we want to be able to digest it in a very simple manner, and I'll go into that in a second too, because I think the resource discussion is very, very important as well. Right now, again, it's machine learning, and it depends on a significant feedback loop from us back to Texas A&M and the information it's getting from the machine. It's only as good as the information you're giving it. Right now, we see about a 40% accuracy level, and our engagement has heightened in the past 2 years as we've started these projects to significantly address some of our worst performing feeders and feeders in these wildfire risk areas. So we ideally want them to become better. We want to be able to use them for predictive analytics going forward, but we need them to be very descriptive in what they are telling us and telling our teams. And the reason behind that is, again, this is the same screen as before. The one item that's not on here is the resource challenge, right? As we heard before in some of the presentations, we want subject matter experts to be side by side with our data analysts, if not data analysts themselves, to be able to utilize these systems. In a vacuum without that, we need the tools to tell our folks who are not analytics savvy what the problem is, where it is, and how to address it. We need it to be very predictive and prescriptive for some of our utilities and utility partners who don't have the capability, don't have the resources or funding to bring in and compete with the Googles of the world, the Oracles of the world, all of these companies that are moving into Austin, we don't have the capability to compete with them on a resource and hiring scale to bring in these talented resources. So we either need to outsource it or we need to strategically bring people in on the early stage of their career or at the end of their career to do that. And with predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics being so new, we really need to rely on outsourced talent, as we talked about before, and we need to rely on outsourced technology that is very prescriptive in where things lie and where they are. We take this information on our distribution system and we pair it with a fully deployed AMI system, and now we can see things that potentially are faulting on the distribution system. We can see asset health all the way down to our meters themselves by getting instantaneous voltage and average voltage and 15-minute interval voltage, health and diagnostic, temperature flags, things of that nature. We pair all of that together. We can see everything from a transformer all the way up to the substation if we're successfully able to do this. Right now, again, these DFAs are not deployed all over our service territory. We are looking to strategically deploy them in our wildfire risk areas so that we can start to get that information back. But we rely on these technologies being funded and created so that we can take advantage of them. So I'm going to pause because I don't really think I took a breath, but.
No, that was great. Bill, thank you very much. That was really, really insightful. You brought up some things that have been brought up before, especially regarding the need for skilled subject matter experts to be working alongside the data analysts to be able to develop the right algorithms and right approaches to assess data and use it. So I think that was really, really useful. Appreciate that. Are there any questions? Okay. Let's continue then. Bill, again, thank you. Really, really appreciate that. And we'll be coming back to you. I want to now introduce David Pinney, who actually works upstairs when we're all assembled in the NRECA building in Arlington. David Pinney is a manager of the analytics program at the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, where he leads software and analytics research efforts with cooperatives, all the cooperatives and their partners across the country. Current research projects include cost-benefit analysis of distributed energy resources, distribution and transmission system simulation, sensor, machine intelligence and modeling platforms, and decision models for resiliency investments. So, David, you're on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Got a few slides here that I'd like to share. Should be up. So just quickly, if you're not familiar, this is the co-op service territory here on the left in green. Co-ops serve about 42 million people and operate about 42% of the nation's distribution lines. So this is rural territory. It's not very dense. Averages about 7.4 consumers per mile of line. That's versus 34 at IOUs, 48 at munis. And this rural territory that is difficult to serve has really driven the co-ops to invest in and deploy technology to keep providing safe, reliable, affordable power. NRECA, we're a national cooperative, and we do the things that make sense on a national scale. And one of those is research. So I'll be talking about kind of where we see big data research going. So I'd like to start with the question, how big is this data that we're actually talking about? So I have a little thought experiment. If we consider AMI, which is currently the largest source of new data, and we consider the largest co-op out there, that's about 500,000 meters, and we take the highest read rates and include all the metrics that we see in common use, temperature, voltage, kWh, et cetera. And we look at that data volume over here. It's about 1 terabyte a year, which is, pretty decent, but still fits on hardware you can buy for $50 off of Amazon. the broader scientific community and vendor community is looking at much larger data volumes. So Google, for example, in 2008, said they were working through about 6,300,000 terabytes a year. And so I bring this up to say, one, I don't think we're great candidates for some of the exotic storage and processing technology that's out there, globally distributed fault-tolerant databases. I don't see it becoming a big emphasis in our operations. However, at the data volumes that we're at and are headed towards, there are still some huge challenges in integrating and realizing value from this data. So the first one I'd like to talk about is integration. And on the left here, you see a diagram of pretty much every IT system a typical co-op needs to operate to run their business. It's about 20. And whenever we talk to IT staff among the cooperatives, we ask, well, what's your biggest problem? And they always say system integration. There continue to be huge opportunities in integrating more system and looking at data across these silos. And it's just a really painful integration effort. A lot of times it's point-to-point integrations, custom integrations. As an industry, we've been chipping away at this for decades now with a lot of standards work. SIM is out there, obviously. NRECA has been working on a standard called multi-speak that operates at the distribution level. And DOE, with its ability to convene vendors and users on a national scale, I think has a real opportunity to figure out why we don't have the interoperability standards that make this problem seamless. Another huge challenge is communications. So here I'm showing data from a 2019 survey showing all the different ways that the co-ops typically read their AMI meters. AMI meters have been extremely successful among the co-ops. About 85% of all the meters are AMI now. But in this kind of communications infrastructure, there's too much detail to tell a clear story, except for there's a huge array of different networks that these utilities need to operate to backhaul all of this data and ultimately make use of it. We're seeing a trend towards fiber and towards higher bandwidth RF systems, but there are still a lot of places where those technologies are not cost effective. From a national standpoint, well, a 100-mile range, low-cost RF technology would be great, and the access to the spectrum necessary to use it. But I think there's another opportunity here around how to easily operate and secure these kinds of networks, which, unlike the technology that a Google is running, have all kinds of different media and all kinds of different protocols. So it's not as easy as administering a single flat TCP/IP network. So machine learning. Machine learning has been really great recently. The tooling that is coming out of the vendor community and also the research community and coming into high quality open source libraries has been, I wouldn't say widely deployed, but has been deployed in some really exciting applications. On the right, I'm just showing screenshots of some things we've done with a couple co-ops. And what the kind of achievable near-term things we've seen load forecasting and storage control algorithms become interesting, especially to distribution operators, are beginning to have the kinds of dispatch challenges that only bigger generation and transmission operators had before, but have not historically had good forecasting and control tools available. And the capabilities available in the emerging ML libraries have been really effective for doing these kinds of things. Load as well as distributed generation disaggregation is another area where we've seen a lot of interest and a lot of progress. Utilities deploying algorithms to pull out constituent loads from meter data signals. Although sometimes it can be hard to monetize, the value can be immense in the case of reaching out to the right customers with the right loads to make sure that they're taking advantage of the rates that are available to them, taking advantage of services that utility offers. As electric vehicle deployment grows, we think pretty much everybody is going to be using these techniques because the value of helping a consumer charge at the lowest cost time could be enormously valuable for everyone. Anomaly detection is another area where we've seen some great results. We have co-ops that have been able to flag customer issues with equipment that's not running correctly, not just sending them sort of a high bill warning, but saying, hey, this looks like an air conditioner compressor that's malfunctioning or a water heater that is locked on. And there have been some great stories that have come out of that. And finally, phase identification. As we move away from power line carrier systems, it's becoming harder to keep track of phasing of meters on the grid, and there are some compelling statistical techniques, or we'd say now machine learning techniques, that can provide this support back in. So we're always looking to spread this technology wider. I think something like about 10 co-ops are using these kinds of tools day to day. And on the national research scale, well, I think we've only really scratched the surface here. There are so many cool results in reinforcement learning for strategic decision making that I think could be really valuable on the grid. We've seen some DOE and national lab efforts move in that direction, but we're excited to see what serious practitioners can do with this technology. I think obviously there's an opportunity in more data. So drone data is a huge one, and I'll talk about that in a second. So PMUs obviously are starting to see really compelling use cases on the transmission system. We're interested in seeing where they could be deployed on the distribution system. I think the biggest barrier right now for PMU data or synchrophaser PMU data is cost. Unit prices are in the tens of thousands. And if that came down, I think we could see more interest in catching some of those short time phenomenon. And finally, on the right, 3D asset scans. So we started to talk to co-ops who are deploying augmented reality and virtual reality applications about a year ago. And our initial thought was, well, this would be super niche and would be mostly used for marketing, honestly, in interaction with the consumer members. And we found a couple co-ops that have gotten huge training and operational value from 3D asset scans that are then used in an augmented reality or virtual reality interface, essentially to replace sort of tedious and expensive trips getting folks together to go out to substations. Some of that training and those inspections can actually be done in VR. And really, we're just sort of learning how to collect this data and integrate it with, say, SCADA information, for example, to really use it well. So drone data, I think, is the most compelling area right now. So about 23% of co-ops are flying with drone programs, and 13% said they're just about to start one. The things you can see from a drone are amazing. And some of the sensor packages, thermal and LiDAR, give you tools that you really didn't have before to look at asset health. Here on the right, I'm showing a very simple, stupid image classifier that we trained to pull asset info out of drone surveys so that operators could, review key frames instead of having to scrub through large amounts of video. This is, not where we want to be with these techniques. What we'd really like is to see the kind of sophistication that we see in the automobile industry where, there are commercial autonomous vehicles available right now. And we think that by applying the kinds of techniques that are actually coming into the public domain for computer vision, you could easily get an inventory, not just pick out the key frames with assets, but get an inventory of what's there, get an indication of whether all the equipment is in good shape. And as we collect more and more drone data, I think these capabilities will be essential just to deal with the additional volume. We've kind of been talking with DOE. We would love to see a big DOE effort in this area. And one area that's kind of interesting about this technology is you need a huge repository of data to start training these kinds of algorithms. And vendors are creating repositories. NRECA is creating a repository. But our sense here is if something could be created at a large scale publicly, that would provide the data necessary so that researchers could come in and really derive value. And finally, planning operational integration. At kind of a specific integration where we see a lot of promise. So on the left here, we have our sort of planning analytics work that we've done with a couple labs. And on the right-hand side, we have an operational analytical tool built primarily for cybersecurity that looks at essentially all the data flowing through the utility through direct packet capture. And where we're headed with this and where we see vendors headed with these kind of systems is an integration of the planning and operational analytics. There's a lot of stuff on the planning side, like power flows for determining cost of service that currently only get run intermittently when major planning exercises are occurring, but could be run really moment to moment, second to second. To kind of do a finer scale planning, but also to catch some things that are only caught on longer time scales. And similarly, on the planning side, there's a lot of great data, a lot of great circuit and configuration data that could be used to enhance the real-time operational analytics, maybe give them a little more predictive power. And so this is, I'd say, an area of research where we think there's a lot of promise. So in summary, data volumes, pretty modest, but very difficult to integrate, very difficult to collect, and lots of opportunities for extracting more data. Yeah, that's what I have. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. That was great. Very, very interesting. Great insights. It's great to see what the co-ops are doing. You guys are doing some advanced things, and we always learn from what you guys are doing. So thank you. Appreciate it very, very much. Chris, do you want to take it from here? I think, first of all, I want to thank Suresh, Bill, and David as well for their presentations. Thanks for your time and your efforts. Your presentations are great. And again, we could have spent a lot more time having you present, but we're a little bit limited. But having said that, we're going to be going into a Q&A session right now. And Chris, would you like to take that over? Would you mind? Can't hear you. There you go.
Do you want us to display those thought questions again that you had?
Sure. That might be a good place to start. but it can move around in any direction.
All right, and Joe, just so you know, I mean, since we took a couple breaks here and there, and we are going to we initially said the Q&A for the session is 50 minutes. We're still going to try to stay with that, so we will end this session at 3:50.
Okay.
So we can. So with that being said, right now, again, if you have a question, please raise your hand in the chat room. I see Wanda with a question thus far. So, and yes, I got a couple of notes about, I guess, Suresh's presentation was coming in distorted. Again, we are going to post all presentations to the website, so you'll be able to take a look at, for whatever reason, the slides were not coming in clear for you. So just as a heads up. So right now I see Wanda's hand, Tom's hand, and Mladen. So that's where we'll go. Wanda, Tom, Mladen.
All right. Again, appreciate the presentations. Very good and insightful, giving us some great ideas on how DOE can help. A question that I have is relative to distributed energy resources. I'm curious what you're doing with data analytics. Bob mentioned that it requires some point-on-wave understanding. We have grid forming technology out there. Aggregators coming into play, what's visible, what's not. Can you just, all of you, kind of explain a little bit more how this impacts your data analytics and what you'd like to do with them?
I can start a little bit at the ISO New England. I think so far as you've seen in the presentation, we have deployed multiple applications and each is trying to address a specific use case. So a lot of the data analytics has been kind of a more local. The data visualization and analytics has been built into that local solution. And that's been the approach so far. So we don't have a kind of a centralized data analytics platform that kind of looking at all the data and trying to address all the use cases yet. I expect as we move forward, as we're moving more of the PMU data into our PI historian, we'll be looking at a more kind of a centralized data analytics tooling and a platform to address that. But we have a different kind of a tools. Sometimes they've been using a Java and a local solution. So a lot of it is more of a decentralized analytics. That's how it's been so far at ISO New England.
So, yeah, this is Bill Kelly. I would say the same. We have a very decentralized set of platforms where we're taking a look at, depending upon the DER in question that we're analyzing it. We do hosting capacity studies through our ADMS and in our planning team. We do very localized analysis through our DERMS or our DERO, which is a standalone, not directly connected specifically to our ADMS. We would do solar hosting down to transformers via our AMI system and analytics tools we have there. So we're very decentralized right now, and part of the effort from Austin Energy that we're engaged with right now is getting not only enterprise solutions, kind of a hub and spoke model, where we have enterprise solutions that can be used, but also kind of more independent solutions that follow the same architecture structure, same governance framework for individual users and engineering teams.
Hi, this is David. I'd say from the co-op perspective, there's a lot of interest right now in just finding the DERs. In the case of electric vehicles, there's no interconnection process, but AMI data is a great indicator of where those new potentially controllable loads will show up. And there are a lot of utilities that aren't seeing high DER penetrations, but I think we'll see more and more interest in analytical approaches to control. We're already seeing it with forecast-based controls for energy storage at the utility level. But if the sort of trend in variable generation holds up, I think there'll be a lot of interest in maximizing load and small generator control.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Tom Bialik.
Great, thanks. Appreciate the presentations. Unfortunately, I've been having some technology challenges the last couple of days. But having said that, one of the things that I would like you guys to talk about is, what are the challenges that you see with trying to take some of the data from, sources beyond your entities, as well as, sort of that data ingestion process. And then when you think about that, what sort of does that sort of sensor or roadmap look like for development of new kinds of applications?
Yes, I'll go first. Hi, this is David again. So for data outside of the utility, I would say the processes we see happening right now are often ad hoc. There are a lot of great public weather data sources. There are a lot of great public GIS data sets, and we see utilities pull them in by hand all the time. I think the dream might be that these data sources are, available behind nice APIs, and so that for the IT staff that have the desire, they can pull them in automatically. In terms of the sensor roadmap, I think from the co-op perspective, a lot of it is, well, we're willing to try anything. I don't think we're certainly familiar with the Texas distribution fault anticipation work. Those kind of small signal technologies are intriguing. The PMU results, seeing those pushed down to smaller scale utilities are interesting. And all these things, there's definitely a question about cost. For new sensors, if they're coming in at $100,000 a pop, that's really not going to be economic for smaller operators.
This is Suresh. I can talk a little bit about the ISO New England. So far, the data obviously we're getting from externally is the PMU data in the field, and we're also getting some weather data. I think the challenges, we haven't had too many challenges in the technology or how to get the data, but what we usually have challenges is really kind of making a strong business case and presenting a value so that we can take some of these proof of concept and test applications we have done, take it to the next level. Obviously, the value of these applications increase more the more data we have. More data we have, that means we need more PMU units out there, and also internally we need more of a commitment to see the value of it. So it's kind of that's where we kind of the big bang approach is always a little harder. So we've been trying to focus more on a deliver early and often. So there's more of an incremental approach so that you can at least show the value. So it's almost like sometimes a ground up approach. You got to show the value, and so that you can see the buy-in, and our business units can see the value of it, and then make it a bigger project to do that. I guess going forward, I see a bigger challenge maybe if we get a lot of fast deployment of different kinds of sensors, especially if we get a lot of low-cost sensors in the future. I think the standardization and the protocols would be key. because we may get a different data types and structures, and that too coming at a really fast pace. So combination of different protocols and structures with a high volume of the data, that interoperability would be very challenging. That's where I see as a going forward. Right now, our data is kind of, we're only getting for 2 different types, so we've been able to manage that. But I think the more and more sensors and other formats get applied, that's where we see a challenge in interoperability.
Yeah, I would just say that for us, as long as it's standards-based, be it data integration or communication integration, as long as it's standards-based, we're okay with integrating with outside sources, but being kind of municipally owned, we have the stack of responsibility, and much of that data currently, for better or worse, resides within our walls and our firewalls. So we may send some data out through a managed service. We're very kind of hesitant to do cloud-based solutions from a data perspective right now. We can obviously go into that later, but so long as it's a standards-based integration, we're comfortable with it.
I can add one more. It may not be related to the technology. The other challenge we have is when we are working with the researchers and other organizations outside ISO on some of these projects, having them getting access to our data, mainly because of the CEI and confidentiality reasons, that's always a challenge. So what that happens is then these researchers and other institutions, they're working on a limited set of data. So that makes it harder to get the kind of a more practical use of the data. So this data security and confidentiality concerns is also an issue, especially when you're working with academia and external organizations.
Well, just to sort of follow up on that, I mean, do you see that, there is value in having DOE sort of, have researchers who have access to your data and information? And how would you set that up, given that there's probably more value in having that, additional background, confidential information embedded in the calculations and embedded in the data so that it actually derives more value? Thoughts?
I think it's definitely we need to have that discussion. I think DOE probably can facilitate some of the discussion about the confidentiality, how to share the data. And the other thing is about we talked about the data coming from different kinds of sensors, as I think even Bill was talking about. The standardization and the formats is a key. That's the role where DOE can play to make sure these data formats and the structures are standardized.
Yeah, I would say what other area we could continue is more of a objective are, especially from our perspective. Again, just to drive it home, we are a municipally owned utility. I guess I'll bore everybody with that statement. But we have very talented, very, very smart, very creative, innovative people, but we don't have, when it comes to innovative technologies, obviously we can't hire talent that has experience there. So we have to rely on outside entities. And one of the things, especially that's held us back even from an adoption of a cloud-based infrastructure or utilization of cloud-based tools, has been, the fear of the unknown. We are moving in that direction now, but it does end up, potentially holding us back in some areas. Things that, the DOE can do outside of, continuing to push, grant-funded opportunities for newer technologies to help in some of these predictive analytics areas, be it applications or physical assets, would be this assistance with assurance. And saying you can share this information, you can share this data in an encrypted way with security and provisions on protected information, but you can share this with outside entities and derive the value, especially from an analytics perspective. I'd love to outsource and partner, I should say, with DOE. We love to do it with EPRI, but we often get hamstrung with, we can't provide that information because it's just a gut reaction to it. Some of it has to be protected, but some of it doesn't. And I think DOE, much like EPRI and other institutions, can help educate that, it's for the better good and that information will be protected.
Yeah, one thing that's harder for a DOE or other organizations is the SIP requirement. The SIP requirements kind of for a lot of the data we have, that's the SIP standards. We kind of, there's no easy way out. We have to make sure that anybody who has access to that data have all the controls in place, including background checks to so many other verifications. We need to keep doing that. That's not an easy nut to crack when you are working with outside parties. How do we make sure that we're not violating any SIP regulations?
Great, thank you. So next in the queue, I have Mladen, followed by Flora, followed by Rick.
Okay. So I'm assuming you can hear me. This is Mladen Kizunaj. I was just going to pursue a little bit what Tom was asking and others about how DOE may step in and help, and many ideas, are already shared. But I'm looking at some big, step functions in this area, like we had around the ARRA, Act, when actually the PMU technology, as you know, is by that time it was around for almost 15, 20 years, and there was a big step function in the funding, and all of a sudden that technology got deployed. The same is with the smart meters, as you recall, and the government was a part of that. DOE was a part of that. So the question I have is, if one looks at this big data analytics, what would be a big, step function that the government, say DOE, could contribute to? We're talking here not about FOAs that are on the street every month, if you will. That's certainly very helpful and injects a lot of funds into research and stuff like that. We're talking about big step functions. So maybe you can comment on that. To help you understand better what I'm asking is really, it boils down to what are the issues that you see today in your operations or maintenance or whatever, function that are needing solutions. Let's take outages, for example. Outages are around us. We did not, get them out of the picture. As a matter of fact, outages are doubling in this country every 10 years in terms of the frequency. And the, United States as a country is not the first on the list of having the most, reliable service in the world either. And so that's just, one example. If we were able to predict outages and mitigate them and avoid, some of the impacts and so on, maybe that's one area. I don't know. I'm just making it up. So can you link something in your own organization that is a huge issue that if there was a step function from DOE in funding that you would be willing to, partner and move the things forward like you did with the, synchrophasers, smart meters, or whatever else might have been in the distributed energy area? I know it's not easy to answer, don't get me wrong. I'm just trying to get a bigger picture of all of this and how the industry, thinks about this.
Okay, at least one use case I can think of is the risks posed by the weather. Weather-related events, I think extreme climate conditions, especially for the New England, there's a kind of we have a coast to coast. We are exposed to different kinds of climate conditions, and there's in the hurricanes of Irene of 2011 or 2012, we had a lot of outages, and also we have a lot of nor'easters and winterized storms. A lot of times, I don't think we have enough tools to kind of come up with more predictive. So I think if we have a better tools that can predict where the outages may happen, so that the control room can take some preventive actions. Sometimes they can resort to switching the transmission lines, and also they can change some of the contingencies that may have been planned. So that's an area that can kind of definitely help. A lot of times we currently use the expertise, the operators have a built-in knowledge, and that's what we tend to rely on. The tools that can use weather forecasts combined with the GPS data to both the different transmission other locations, so that we can do some predictive analytics where outages can happen in the next few hours. Okay, this kind of where we were working on a project. I think we did a pilot on what we call it a look ahead power grid risk monitor, and that's kind of is trying to help that. That's definitely an area where we can see that adds the value to our business. Instead of relying on subject matter experts in a control room, the tools can provide the data so that they can make more informed decisions, especially plan ahead and take some preventive actions to improve the reliability of the grid.
Well, I'm on the record as thinking imagery from drones is the most exciting use case based on what's happened in other industries. But regarding sort of a massive investment to see a huge change, I think it's tricky with analytical approaches, because really what you have to invest in is researchers doing exploratory data analysis. So we've been excited to see more of these technical assistance programs come out of DOE, where these incredibly well-trained researchers from the lab complex get deep into problems at the utilities. And I think an issue after the problem is solved, I think there's a question of how do these results get propagated back into the community. In the computer science field, somebody just releases a library and it gets picked up. In our field, things often have to go through vendors. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but it feels like there's an opportunity that the analytics that do get developed in these exercises get put into the community in a sustainable way.
So yeah, really quickly, I would agree with what both of my fellow panelists just mentioned. As I, kind of presented before, from an asset management perspective, weather-related incidents are a big impact on our distribution system, and being able to predict what might occur or where faults might happen is a very significant issue for us. We do have some flooding in the Austin area. We're on the Colorado River, and obviously the state of Texas has significant issues with weather-related events down by the coast. And for those utilities who could benefit from technology, either through technology itself or through analysts who understand the data and can provide that information back, something akin to predictive and prescriptive assistance in those areas, based upon weather information coming in, and then analytics from smart meters and from any of the equipment on your distribution system substation, would be highly beneficial.
Thank you very much. Our next member is Flora Flynn.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you very much to all the panelists. This has been an excellent discussion. My question is mostly for Suresh, but would welcome other perspectives as well. You talked about use cases related to DER, and I just wondered if you could give us some examples of what those use cases might be.
Use cases related to the DER?
Yes.
Maybe I misspoke. I don't recall speaking about any use case related to the DER. I guess if maybe it's was it a DFR, digital fault recorder data? If that's the one that we are using a DFR data to do some of the post-event analysis using a phasor analytics data. So we try to combine a PMU data, SCADA data, and a DFR data to do a post-event analysis. That's kind of, I remember, I don't think we have any use case related to, at least I'm not aware of any use case related to the DER.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I misheard.
Yeah.
Flora, do you have a follow-up?
Sorry. I think I was on mute, Chris. I said thanks, and maybe I misheard what he was saying earlier about DFRs versus DERs.
Oh, okay. Rick, you're up. Rick.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody, for the presentation. It's really good stuff. So my question goes to your thoughts on the critical pathway, the queuing of the introduction of the various technologies, and it comes back to giving advice to the DOE on really the prioritization of the work. I think if there needs to be that at the labs, what's the best order of use of the information that the labs can provide to you, and how does it fit into your capital planning, your operational planning, and obviously the sort of the pathway going forward to anticipate what the investments are going to be, because you can't do all this at one time, right? What's your best thoughts, and how can the labs prioritize their work to get you what you need in order of the priorities you're going to be deploying these technologies? Nobody wants to answer that, or was I not clear?
I'll jump in. This is Bill. So, our priorities might be different from other priorities. I won't say Muni again, I promise. But, our responsibility is to our customer base, who are basically our, we're owned by the city of Austin. We're a city government entity, and so our responsibility is to be fiscally responsible. We're supposed to be revenue neutral, which makes it hard to do investments, right? To do proactive, innovative investments that don't have a return that's in the red. And if it is, it has to be something that hits the key high notes, which are consistent delivery of reliable energy and safety. So, or driving down costs. So I would say anything that can hit those three simultaneously would be things that we would be interested in. There's, as I said again, and I might be biased because my programs are very focused on resilience, but anything that impacts the resilience of our grid from a hardening perspective would be something that we would definitely be interested in. So whether it's back office analytics that can help push forward the narrative that if we take this data that we have, we are data rich. If we take this data that we have and appropriately mine it, we can see return on investment, on that rather than waiting for these use cases to bubble up elsewhere and come to us. Investing in analytical tools and investing in storage for data, investing in large warehouses or taking that leap into cloud, we need use cases for that. We need significant use cases and business cases for that, and we can't prove something we haven't done yet. So the labs being able to say, hey, you've got these data sets, and if you use them in this way, you'd be able to find these issues, these safety concerns, you'd be able to increase your reliability, drive your costs down. Those would be very beneficial for us.
I think speaking from the perspective of NERCA, it's hard to prioritize investment interest across 900 utilities because it's going to vary significantly. I think in terms of, getting DOE more engaged with the utilities, I think in the area of analytics, one thing that could be very valuable is ease of use. So projects that end in an IEEE paper, those are incredibly hard to pick up and use at a utility. I'll just say probably impossible. If it's a full new analytic that ends up, as a plugin to a vendor tool or to a tool that has a clear interface to the kinds of data that a utility collects, I think then you'll see kind of more immediate engagement.
I can talk a little bit from our perspective, but I see going forward where DOE can help is probably more in the two things. One is I think cloud is going to play a big part going forward. Maybe cloud-based streaming, like maybe PMU data streaming into the cloud. So doing more research on that and coming up with the use cases and proving that and providing some guidance on how to implement that. That's something I can think of that could be useful. And then the other thing I talked about already is any standardization of the formats and structures for the new types of sensors coming in. I think analytics side, I usually follows that. I think we need to have a good data first and also platform that can house this data as well as we can stream the data to a platform. And once we tackle that, I think for the analytics side, there is lots of different solutions available. That does not mean we can start using them right away, but I think we need to address the data issue first, and then we can move into more of analytics.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Rick. With that, if we don't have any other hands, unless Juan or Wanda, you have your hands raised again. If not, then Joe, I don't know if you want to take over and ask a question.
Yeah, no. First of all, Wanda and others, please speak up, and then maybe I'll say a couple of things or ask a couple of things.
Yeah, my hand was left over, Joe. So go ahead and I'm interested in hearing your comments.
Well, I've written pages and pages of notes, and I'm really trying to search for where DOE provides value. I mean, it come out in the conversation, but I'm looking through my notes, and here are some of my thoughts as I've listened to the conversation from earlier as well as now. It's fairly obvious, and I thought, I don't know where we are in this, and then I've never had a clear answer in this. But when it comes to standardization of data formats and data structures and exchanging information across disparate systems, I don't know. I've never heard anyone articulate specifically where we are in that problem and what is the roadmap to get through that. Now, maybe I haven't read the right things. I know that NIST is working on this. I know that this is a major issue that came up during the Recovery Act. But is this worth taking another look at to find out where we are and how we need to move forward to be able to deal with the standardization issue? What are your thoughts on that?
So Joe, I've got a couple of comments on that. So I think that there's really sort of two issues that we've teased up previously in some of these conversations. One of which is, the ability to be able to easily take data from, whether it be NOAA or wherever it is, and ingest it into systems with a minimal amount of data massaging effort. Okay, so that's sort of one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is the brief conversation with regards to sort of data cleanup, right, or data gaps. How, if you go out and get a data set, a lot of times you're going to find that there's gaps in the data. How does that get addressed? How does that get cut and pasted, if you will, to eliminate those gaps? And then that sort of brings up the other item with regards to sort of the timing and alignment of the data and the data sets. Because, for example, PMUs will have GPS time clocks. You'll have other data, SCADA data that we see ours drifting over time. How do you bring all those pieces together? Those are actually significant problems to be able to sit there and then start driving into some of these use cases to understand what issues do I have.
Yeah, and I think I'll just interrupt here before others speak. I think we can't boil the ocean, right? So it's probably really important to determine what some key use cases are. And maybe there's some general things that need to occur. And I guess one of the questions I have for you and the panelists is do they see the government as having a big role in the standardization issue and cleanup issue? Does the government need to step in to deal with this issue is a question that I have.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to step in. Our speakers are the ones that are invited to comment. But I've been following, like many others, the standardization process, for years and years and years, 30, 40 years now. And governments step in at some level, but it's primarily in the United States anyway. In the power business, it's been the community, the professional community. It's been the IEEE and others that have been driving the standards. Now the government did step in 2007 as a result of the ESA Act. The Smart Grid Interoperability Panel was created and is still active, I believe, and that's a different issue. That is the issue of interoperability. Once you define a standard, has anybody, compliant with that standard, for example? So my gut reaction is that the government wouldn't be necessarily, involved in these standards. However, government can help certain issues that Tom was referring to, because, the picture at the end of the day is kind of a, data from inside the utility and data from outside the utility. From inside utilities, if you go to the substations and this and that, more or less, all of that is covered by the standards. The Contrades of this world, 61850s, whatever you want to call them. There's a whole bunch of them out there. When you start going outside, the standards that are used are coming from a totally different, industries and things like that. And so you have that integration of data across quite diverse standards, but they still do exist. So I think it's more this interoperability problem than the standards development where the government can contribute.
Okay. Anyone else?
No,
Yeah.
Well, I would just add on to that, you think about what DOE did to enable the early work of IEEE 1547, and that actually came out of IEEE, but NREL, and some dedicated resources really was a catalyst to get it started. So maybe there's some parallels there that we could think about in the data world.
Okay. There's another item that came up, and David Pinney, you brought it up, and I thought it was really interesting, and I didn't understand it completely. We were talking about machine learning, and you had that list of machine learning applications. You talked about phase identification, and I didn't really understand what the issue was there because I'm just not technically adept enough in that arena. But you also talked about drones, etc. What in these areas and whatever other areas of machine learning, what do you think are the rich areas for additional exploration and R&D, especially where the government can help? What do you think? And others. I don't mean just to focus here on picking on David, but Suresh and Dale, if you've got thoughts around this too, I'd be really, really interested. David, would you mind?
Oh, sure. I struggle to describe phase ID well, but essentially it's trying to gather kind of better details about connectivity of the system that sometimes can get messed up. Very hard to track. I think why we're excited to work with the government on machine learning is because the labs have true experts in this domain. It takes 10, 15 years and a PhD or two to actually make progress on new methods in this area. The co-ops have picked up and used techniques that are out there, but I think the government's opportunity is to look at the kind of really hard new emerging areas. So reinforcement learning, for example, has shown huge promise in game playing. The most powerful Go player on the planet is a computer now, and we thought we wouldn't see that for decades, but instead reinforcement learning techniques made that happen, in our lifetimes. This deep expertise is just something that utilities, especially if there are only 50 staff at the utility, something they just can't staff with. The reinforcement learning piece in particular, I think is an opportunity in control, and kinds of wide area control with lots of very finicky devices that we're starting to see emerge with all of the DERs out there.
Okay, no, that's really useful. Bill or Suresh, did you have any comments? Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, so my last question, and we've got to close in 4 minutes. Well, my last question is a process question. There's a lot of information that's come up in these discussions, and the major question is, where do the labs, where does DOE play a critical role? Now, I know a little bit about what our folks in the Office of Electricity are doing in the research and development area, and I know very well they reach out to industry all the time. I know that they've got working groups in a lot of different areas. areas, microgrids. I know Eric is out there. I know they're all out there. So I may be speaking incorrectly when I say this. But I'm wondering whether there should be, or how valuable it might be, to actually have some working groups developed where we can determine really, for instance, how the labs can be working with industry in these areas effectively, identify that, and then let's say machine learning is one of those areas, then be able to drill down in that area and determine specifically what is a technology development roadmap around developing machine learning algorithms that are useful to the industry. Is it worth, when thinking about next steps, to actually develop working groups like this? And they may be developed already, so my apologies to anyone if these are already in place. But would it be useful for DOE to be working really closely with the utility industry in this arena to really figure out what the next steps are? Yeah.
I mean, my perspective is I think there would be value in that. I mean, I do work with national labs a lot, and so I know a lot of things that they are doing. The advantage of bringing in sort of a workshop environment would be the fact that, you know, what you hear today is you hear the perspective of sort of what the utilities are, what they're doing, where they're going. The challenge a lot of times, I think, is sort of, as you heard as well, is the access to, you know, talented people that, you know, with, you know, some of the compute capabilities within the national labs. You know, we don't have some of these high-performance computing platforms that the labs do, and they, you know, you can run things, you can do much more sort of scenario analysis on things that we just don't have the capabilities to do. But having sort of the direction or being driven by the needs of the utilities is really helpful. There are third parties out there that are trying to offer these things as a service, but I would also argue that you know, if you look at some of the smaller utilities and co-ops, you know, they don't necessarily have the resources to go out and do that kind of work. And so, you know, I've just noted that there was another, you know, partnership opportunity that was DOE announced on the ERE, right? And you go, okay, so is there that opportunity for DOE to do this? And I think the answer is yes. And I know we work with NREL on a variety of things, and my point to them is that you're doing this work for us, I mean SDG&E, but there's an opportunity to develop it into some sort of open source that others can now leverage and utilize based upon the work you've done with us.
Okay. That's useful. Thanks. Any other comments here? We have to close. Any comments from the panelists? But for the sake of time, let's close this session. But I want to really thank you, Suresh and Bill and David, for your time. You provided some great insights. We appreciate your efforts. And we probably will be rolling back to you as well with the other panelists from this morning's, from the earlier session, just to get clarification on some things. So again, thank you very much. And Chris, would you like to take it from here?
Yeah. Well, first off, I just want to check with Wanda. Wanda, do you want to power through and get over to the smart grid update?
I would be willing to do that. I know we've all been sitting here a while, but I think the rest of the agenda, Tom, are you prepared to just jump into this smart grid update right away?
Yeah. Chris just has to put it out.
Okay.
So, one housekeeping item before we move on to Tom and Darlene's presentation is if there is any member of the public that would like to give public comment, please message me in the chat box. Following Tom and Darlene's presentation, we will have our public comment period. Thus far, I have not received any requests. So I just want to make that general item. And with that being said, I am going to share the screen for Tom and Darlene. That rhymed kind of. Okay, hold on a second. All right, Tom, you're a go.
Okay, great. So if you go to the next slide, Chris.
All right. Oh, look, now my PowerPoint's not responding. Okay, hold on a second. Man, this has just been the best day of technical difficulties that ever existed. Okay.
Yeah, don't feel bad. I've been having the blue screen of death every couple of hours. So I think what we wanted to talk about and update the EAC on is where we are from a Smart Grid Subcommittee perspective and the kinds of things that we're doing or propose to do, I think is another point. So these are really the initiatives. You're aware of the state federal. We spent, another session on that, and we'll talk about that now. Darlene, take care of that. Talk a little bit about the big data, where we go with that. Give you now perhaps a preview of something I think, we're going to work with on the Smart Grid Subcommittee on this whole sort of idea of advanced grid and talk a bit about that. And then we'll get an update from, I think, Joe on where we are with the Smart Grid annual assessment. And then lastly, resiliency. Is that something that we want to take on? So if you go to the next slide, Chris. So I will pass the baton to Darlene on this. And Darlene?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So from a state-federal coordination perspective, we had, a conversation yesterday that I thought was fruitful. So just to kind of give everyone an update as to where we are conducting interviews to gauge industry appetite for convening forums that might drive coordination on key topics. What you see to the right are some of the interview questions that we are asking. We wanted to be consistent in the questions that we asked, so that we would have a good comparison of answers and to gauge what we think the industry might think about such a task. We hope to have those interviews completed by the end of this month. You all were part of the EAC discussion yesterday. That was really meant to get additional ideas on topics, and then to consider areas that we might need to incorporate that might drive success of this effort. And then last of all, the goal is to take all of that information that we've accumulated, including some of the polling that we did internal to the Smart Grid subcommittee itself, and then to come out with a recommendation by the end of this year. So with that, I will turn it back over to Tom.
Great. So is there any questions as far as sort of where we are with that before you leave? Wanda or any of the EAC committee members, what we're trying to achieve? Hopefully it's obvious the goal ultimately is to, produce something, go back to DOE to say, well, here's, we did a survey, we prioritized things. DER was one of the issues that was high on the list. So then the question becomes, what can DOE do? How can DOE help with this? So we'll be getting back to you with that. The next slide, please.
So, Tom, do you mind if I chime in real quick on this?
Oh, yeah, sure. No problem. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So my only feedback on this particular issue, and I don't know if David Meyer is on the call right now. David, are you on? Okay. So essentially, I just want to make sure of two things that I think that we would want to see coming from the EAC in regards to state federal. And that's number one is, I think you touched on this a little bit, and I think it goes without saying, is that we want to make sure that we are getting recommendations from you all that are actionable on DOE's behalf. You know, and again, that can focus on our convening authorities, but that could also focus on things that we actually have direct impact on. I do want to avoid kind of getting into maybe jurisdictional arguments that may be creeping out there with other agencies. That would be one thing that I would avoid. The other consideration is that we would always appreciate recommendations from the standpoint of where do you see areas that we are deficient in funding that you think if we were to increase funding in certain areas, we would make more of an impact. And I think that goes across the board for every recommendation that would be coming out. So, you know, making those cases, getting those recommendations from the EAC, I think are paramount of importance, especially when we go and start doing budget justifications and things of that nature. So those types of things I think would be extremely helpful to us, and not just for these recommendations, but I think for all recommendations.
Thanks for that, Chris. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's really the goal, is recognizing that, you know, it's more about, you know, your convening power. You know, for example, you spend a lot of time, you know, DOE staff spend a lot of time with Nehru Nazio and, you know, others. And, you know, is there something that in that conversation or that potential conversation that, you know, bringing up issues that, you know, can be addressed in with having those multiple parties present. And I think that that's really sort of important. Okay, so thanks for that. Next slide, please. So big data. We've sort of seen a lot of things so far. I know everybody said, well, you know, as Joe said, we could probably talk about this forever. It's a big deal. But ultimately, I know DOE is looking for, well, what is it that they can do? So we've had the vendor capabilities. We've talked about phaser measurement units. We've talked about sensors. We've now talked about the utility perspective. So I've got a number of items, notes that I've taken during the course of this. I know Malad has as well. And the goal will be that we will work on taking those notes and comments and providing recommendations to DOE. I think, Joe, you know, you've asked the right question, which is, you know, what can DOE do here? Again, I think there are some very concrete things that DOE can do that, you know, and it may require some funding, may require industry participation, outreach, workshops. You know, it's really about how can we leverage, from my perspective, how can we leverage DOE and inform DOE on areas that provide value to industry. And so that's sort of where we are from that perspective. Anybody have any questions, comments, anything they want to add?
Tom, are you thinking the recommendations will be available by the February meeting?
I would expect yes.
I think the comment, I don't remember who said it, but, you know, we went through so much smart grid investment and adoption through the ARA phase, and now the data is accumulating, and this is almost a natural outcome. But there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, and Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, you know, one of the things that I always keep hearing is, you know, how can we leverage the labs and all the smart people that you've got in the labs to do, you know, to assist industry and move basically move the ball significantly, because I think that's really where we are at this point, is how can we, I know we're doing some things internally at SDG&E, but I think that there's some broader needs that, DOE could really help out.
Yeah, and on that, we're all resource constrained, right? Even the lab folks are resource constrained. Everybody's really busy, right? The labs are working on some very interesting things, and as you know, they have great capabilities here. What I don't know, the big question mark for me is, and again, it may not be a valid question mark, is how do we really develop a relationship between the industry, the utilities, and the labs so that we can affect more near-term outcomes? That's always a question, and I don't know what the processes are or mechanisms for doing that. It's a difficult thing to address, to answer. But again, what is the platform for discussion that may not be there, could be there, but may not, that maybe we should think about to really affect the engagement between the utilities and the labs, and to be able to get meaningful products out of that conversation. So I'll just stop there.
Joe, this is Tom Weaver.
Yeah.
Hey, this conversation reminds me of the success we had working with PNNL in the early days of volt bar optimization.
Yeah.
They really understood the analytics and they had the tools. We really understood what was happening practically, and that collaboration became very successful. We could have some of the same situation developing here, where the labs have the high-powered analytic capabilities that we've heard from several presenters. It's hard for the utilities to be able to pay for those, but yet the labs probably don't have that practical understanding of what goes on in the utility. So when you marry those two up, there could be some real opportunity there.
Tom, I remember calling you and you having Kevin Schneider and you on the phone with me to try to help me figure things out. And that was and I read all those reports, and that was incredibly useful. And what I'd like about what you're suggesting, Tom, and you're always suggesting this, is that we should really start from a problem-specific place, from a real problem. Because, this arena is so large, but if we actually focus on a real utility issue and bring that collaboration that you just recommended together, then I think it becomes really meaningful and more targeted. I think it's a great recommendation.
But it also, if I may just jump in for a second, it also requires some level of consensus, on the part of industry. What are the problems? Voltage VAR control was recognized always as a problem. As a matter of fact, it's a problem even more now than it ever was before, with everything else happening. So, if there was a problem recognized by industry widely, then the priority of the issue pops up. And so one can then recommend to DOE and say, listen, industry thinks that this problem or that problem is really, extremely important. And so can something be done about that? Think about NASP and synchrophasers. I mean, it was recognized because of the outage in 2003, August, that the SCADA system was not able to pick up certain things. So it was widely recognized that the fidelity of the SCADA system is not sufficient to monitor what's happening in the grid. And based on that, the investment was made in synchrophasers. And after that, NASP was formed, which was also funded, if you recall, by DOE initially. Mm-hmm. And a lot of good stuff came out of that effort. So I think as a part of this big data, Tom and Joe and others, Wanda, I think it would be nice to pull our notes together and do maybe even a broader survey of industry to try to articulate the issues that the big data can address that are sort of of a very high importance. And once that is recognized, then the priority of things goes up, and it's easier to recommend something to DOE under such priority understanding.
Well, thanks for that, Milan. I'm making some notes, and certainly I think that goes into the recommendations to DOE.
Hey, Tom, this is Mike. May I add also to Milan? Really piggyback at what Tom said and Milan added. The fintech space, JP Morgan Chase is doing things, and I know people touched on machine learning, AI, and things, but there are parallel spaces that have a lot of disparate data out there that they're trying to develop into some more intelligence. And the fintech space, I'm not sure if there's someone out there watching that, but I mean, I'm not expert at it. We just added that to our innovation center here in Westerville. Just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, no, Mike, I mean, I think the comments, that's a really valid comment. I mean, typically what I've seen, over my career is that once you look sort of beyond your own domain, people are doing a lot of very neat, interesting things with technology that, you could then take and leverage over in the utility world. And it's just because nobody in the utility world ever stopped to take a break and go read something else or go look at something else.
So, Tom, this is Bob. What Tom Weaver was mentioning gave me an idea that to take the labs and use them to emulate some of the case studies that we're seeing in terms of how do you run storage systems, how do you do integration and aggregation of DER, how does that all play together? Sort of like a war games of different philosophies of DERMS control or redispatch under the new paradigm. Perhaps that might be an area to explore with using the labs. They do have a lot of capability there.
Yeah, and I agree, Bob. And I know you were on that NREL grid interface WebEx thing on Tuesday. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I absolutely agree that there's lots of opportunities. It's a question of sort of steering them in the appropriate direction.
Well, we're pretty good at herding cats, so it could be an interesting exercise.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. Any other comments, thoughts? Okay, Chris, you want to go next slide? There we go. So I alluded to this yesterday, and we've had this conversation in Smart Grid Subcommittee. And Joe and I have been having this conversation back and forth for quite a while. The whole idea of, well, what is it going to take to really do this advanced grid? And so what I show here is, and I think at the next Smart Grid Subcommittee, we'll be looking for volunteers to more fully flesh this out. This was an effort internally at San Gas Electric to really sort of say, okay, if we take the volumetric rate and we unbundle it and say, how are these things provided by, let's say, in quote unquote, a utility, and what are those kinds of services? We've got here really, the idea being that if you take that volumetric rate, you talk about generation services, voltage regulation services, reliability services, resiliency services, and describe what those services are, and then say who's doing what, whether it be distribution, transmission, generation, and what does it take to actually do that? And what would it take for, how's it done now, which is really sort of this traditional grid? What does it look like if it was distributed? with much more customer DER, et cetera. And then you've got, another version of this, which is a shared scenario where, shared responsibility of grid ownership of services between utility and customer and third parties. And then lastly, how, if you look at the T&D coordination thing, can we now sit there and say, well, what does that look like? What do these 4 different scenarios look like? And what does that look like potentially from a cost perspective? Where are we now? Where do we go in this highly distributed environment, and some variants of that. So looking at really trying to flesh out, well, what are those services? Again, I'm just giving you the example that we did initially and internally, but you can see things like energy and capacity. That's a really, really simple example. It's done via generation, but if a customer is going to do it, what does that really mean? And if they don't do it, what are the consequences? And you can look at it and say, well, okay, things like load generation balance, how is that done? Well, it's a system that matches the real-time energy needs with a resource, and typically today that's generation resources. Customer's going to do it. They're going to have these resources as well, but they're going to have some control system to do that. And if they don't, then there's going to be A, power surges, and B, potentially outages. You can sort of walk through this list. Things like frequency regulation, okay? How does it get done again? Well, you got AGC signal every 4 seconds, but if somebody, again, is going to do them on their own, what is it that they need to do? And what's the consequences of not doing that? And then you look at it and say, AC, air conditioning and motor startup. How is that done today? Well, you can see there's components within the distribution system, transmission system, and generation system that ultimately accommodate that. But you can see here that, for an individual customer to do that or a group of customers to do that, how does that happen? Because if you look at it, a lot of people believe that, well, if I just put a PV system on my roof, for example, that I'm going to be able to start my AC system or a large motor, and the answer will be, the real answer is no. That'll never happen, not unless you do lots of other things. And then you can see VAR support, voltage regulation, power quality, reliability of services, outage scheduling, redundancy, component failure, equipment. You just look at it and say, well, what does that really take? And if you think about it in this context, then I think you get a more complete picture of, as I alluded to yesterday, what does it take to ensure that when you plug your device into the outlet, it actually works, or you flip on the light switch, it actually works. And so fully sort of fleshing that out, and so I think the next Smart Grid Subcommittee meeting can ask for volunteers to help flesh this out. And then once we've done that, then moving forward into, okay, well, how do we do that now? What does that look like from a cost perspective? And then looking at these other options and moving forward. So with that, I will stop and ask for comments, feedback, perspectives. People want to volunteer. Great. But that's sort of where one of the things I think the next thing for the Smart Grid Subcommittee to take on. Any thoughts?
I personally like the scenario idea. I think it's a nice way to peel back the layers of the onion and try to get to some specifics.
Yeah, well, thanks. Because I think that where we're going with this is just to recognize that. So I think there's a lot of, the answer is, well, DER can do all these things. And then you say, okay, I agree they can, theoretically, but what does it actually really take? What are all the things that we're really looking for DER to do? And can they do it? Can they provide that? And if they can, how would they provide that? What are the implications? There's a complexity implication, there's systems implications, there's communications, and all of those have some costs associated with them.
Hey, Tom, this is Joe. I'm not sure if I brought this up in our discussions. Maybe, but let me just ask. Are you looking first at the distribution system, or should we think about combining, or at some point combining transmission and distribution, the whole grid? What are your feelings on that?
So I think, Joe, I mean, that's really, I think, where it becomes ultimately everything, right? You're really saying, how do I do this? If I look at how do I do this today, there's a T component, there's a D component, there's a G component, right? And then you sit there and say, okay, here's how we do it now. We can look at the distribution system alone and say, well, how would we do that? How would it aggregate up to transmission, and then how do we actually control it, right? And I think that those are open. It's an open conversation as to how far we go, don't go. But I think based upon the conversation we had before, it's sort of these at least four scenarios that we think about, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, just to add to this, if I may, in these scenarios, which I agree you are needed, one of the major components is not necessarily the technology. It is who the stakeholders are. When you look at the wholesale market or retail market or transmission or distribution, you can identify stakeholders that are traditional stakeholders. Now, you start looking at the customer side, and they start owning assets, whether it's generation or storage or whatever it is. And these customers may be small, may be big. And then you look at the aggregators and you look at some other parties. You start looking at different stakeholders participating in these scenarios. And I think that is a huge component of this scenario, game playing, if you will, to see what's what,
Yeah, I agree, Malad. This was not an attempt to be inclusive at this point. The goal would be to sit there and take this and flesh this out in a little bit more detail to make sure that we've sort of got the bases covered such that we could then, move to the next step. So the first step is really just to take something like this, flesh it out, and then once we flesh it out, then go to these four potential scenarios and figure out, well, what does that really mean? What are the implications?
Right.
Yeah, and if you think about this from a standpoint of who provides it along your lines, Milan, why did we interconnect the electric grid in the first place? It was the scale that made it worthwhile. Displacement of load and lower reserves necessary. So I think that's one of the big issues that we say, well, how distributed can the system be? Well, if everybody's trying to do it on their own, there'll be a hell of a lot more power that they're going to have to install. So I think this has a lot of promise, Tom.
Tom Weaver has his hand up. I'm sorry, Tom. I just saw it. Yep.
Sorry, Chris. That was leftover.
Oh, okay. Roger that. Just wanted to make sure. All right. Back to you, Tom B.
So is there any other thoughts, comments, questions? This will be something that we want to talk about at the next market subcommittee meeting. Okay, hearing none. Next slide. And I think that it's going to be you, Joe. Where are you in your wonderful report that I know you've been working on?
The wonderful report, right? That is like, so It's about 130 pages long. It's written. It's weak in one section, and I've got an internal review right now, not only in the TPTA side of OE, but also in the R&D side of OE. It is. I'm going to be working exclusively over the next like 2 or 3 or 4 days with folks in the R&D group. I'm working with them on trying to bolster the sensing, communication, and control section. I have really good information on sensing and communication technologies and then data analytics. Where I'm a little bit weak, and Bob, I'm thinking about you here, Bob Cummings, a little bit here. I want to bolster the control side to it. Now, realize that this is really for the audience is for mostly lay folks in a sense that are in Congress and that are probably regulators. I think that's the primary audience. But the philosophy has always been teach them to fish a little bit so that we're not just throwing stuff at them, but they really kind of understanding fundamentally what's going on and they can move on from there, right? So we've talked about issues around coordination across the transmission and distribution system space, et cetera. And so what, Bob, the reason I'm coming back to you here is that, you know, I've looked at your waveform paper. In fact, we even cite it in the report because we talk about spatial and temporal issues, you know, with regard to managing this grid, right? But you brought up something today which got into the control thing, which I understand conceptually, which is we've got all this interaction now between these control systems, and we've got to make sure these control systems are working in a synergetic way, right? Because they could be doing conflicting controls and stuff like that, right? And
exactly.
And you talk about even being able to look at point-on-wave data from an inverter fleet, because that's going to affect generation control, I think, right? Those things have to be coordinated. So I think I might want to talk a little bit about that, you know, like a paragraph or something, or in this paper. And so I'm probably going to circle back to you because I think we're a little bit weak on the control, what we need to be looking at on the control side of things. But other than that, go ahead.
There's a real big thing with we live in a world with rotating machinery, and the time constants with the rotating machinery and the controls of rotating machinery are extremely well understood. But the control philosophies employed by the hundreds of thousands of inverters, we don't know very much about it at all, and we're certainly not. We really need to. It's become almost completely a controls problem. So that's it's like, you got my foot wet, but now I got to go in over my head,
So that's a major issue that we have to talk about, I think, here. And let me just ask you this really quickly, and we can circle back offline. But do you have, or anyone here has, a really good report or a set of reports that really talks about kind of where we are and what this issue is?
Let me cogitate on it. I think there's a couple. One that was done by a gentleman from ERCOT, and there's another one about machine controls and subsynchronous resonance and control interaction. From an IEEE conference about 4 years ago.
Okay, that would be really, really useful because I need some really good sort of background information to be able to dig into it. So to answer your question, first question is, I think by the end of next week we should have all of this information in place and written up, and I would think the week after next week we can get this to you. So that's the time frame I am on right now. We're on.
Okay, well, great. And Joe, I would just add that in the context of that control piece, there's a perspective to perhaps put out there, and that would be, for example, and I know Bob's aware of, the Blue Cut Fire example, right, where you've got all these power electronic-based, inverter-based resources that trip offline because of the actual sort of the design of the frequency control protection scheme. And so what you see is that you've got a lot of people who are more computer science guys that are actually doing the design for the controls with very little understanding of the actual real sort of operational world that these things are going into.
Okay, that's great. You sent me information on that, I believe.
I've got all of the reports.
Oh,
package them all up if you'd like.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to take a look at it. I'll have to figure out how to do it in an efficient way. But yeah, these are really important points and they're timely. So, and then people really have to understand that this is what's happening. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Joe, I think that it would be worth mentioning the grid forming, inverters, because, the power electronics, that's what it is. It can be controlled many different ways to achieve different goals. And I think that would help for distributed component that Bob was mentioning.
Okay.
There were a lot of people in California that were surprised that their rooftop solar didn't do anything for them when they went into the PSPS outages.
Right.
All these inverters are voltage following.
Right. Okay. Let me see if I can dig into that and become learned on that and see if we can express it appropriately.
I've got a really good resource for you on that. Guy who works for Capri.
That'd be great. And Mladen, you used a term called grid forming.
Yeah, grid forming inverters.
So that's a key term. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
It's basically an inverter that can start itself. It doesn't have to have a voltage waveform from an external source in order to run.
Okay. Luckily, I'm working with Patrick Dalton, right, who worked on the IEEE standard and understands how they applies and stuff. So we'll get into this conversation. We're going to have a discussion tomorrow. So thank you. And whatever you can send, just send me and we'll figure out how to incorporate it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks. Anything else?
Wait a minute. Chris missed my hand up there, Tom. Could I enter in?
Sure. Go for it.
Joe, I know this is kind of the rear view mirror thing. And I understand your limitations there. I just would hope that there's some, I call it extrapolations, or where do we think we're going with it and what the problems may be as we are going there. Now, I do have the 65 blackout report that Bob Cummings always has a lot of resources, but I don't think that was too smart in that. But anyway, if you could, I know your limitations on that, but what I'm really interested in, Joe, is where do you see an impediment as we start extrapolating from where we are?
Okay. I think let us know whether we did that. There's a whole section that deals with there are two sections. One that kind of lays out what the trends and resulting systemic issues are. And there's one whole section that talks about that. And there's another section that talks about specific challenges as a result of how we're moving forward into the future with distributed grid and resilience issues and all of the issues that we're bringing up. So I'd be really interested once we give it to you, if you can help us shape it where it needs to go. That just would be great, Mike. And hopefully we covered that, but if we haven't done a good enough job, just let us know. Thanks for that.
Okay.
Anybody else? One more slide to go.
Okay.
So this has been discussed quite a bit. I know that we have this conversation a lot, but NARM, we've got all sorts of things. The question with regards to resiliency, what is it? How's it defined? Short-term, long-term? What does this all mean? Do we tackle this? Should we tackle this within the context of the Smart Grid Subcommittee? I know it's been brought up in the past. Just want to throw it out there, Wanda, that it's just be another conversation that I think we'll have at the next Smart Grid Subcommittee meeting. Do we think, even with it right now, what does the EAC think? Is there something we need to add to our list of things to do?
Hey, Tom, this is Mike.
Yep.
The dumbest thing the industry ever did was label smart grid, because at that time no one knew what it was, and everyone implied that we have a dumb grid. But the reality is we've evolved, and we do know what the sense of smart grid is, and maybe we could extrapolate how smarter it could be. I think it's worthy to begin the conversation of resilience, because it comes up so many times, with first making sure the regulator knows what resilience is with respect to reliability. And then we have to, make sure we get the NERC world to make sure we distinguish. Anyway, that's my comment.
Yeah, Mike, I think we could probably open with the phrase, a smart grid is only as smart as you make it.
I just wanted to add a comment on resilience. I agree with Mike. I think we should keep that. But, we should tie this discussion to the discussion of the risk analysis in the power systems. Because, reliability really covers everything except when you start looking at different options of what you can do by different means, which is in the area of risk mitigation. So resilience is directly tied to the risk mitigation methods. And it may not be even a metric. It may be just a set of procedures and construction approaches and standards to take to keep the grid intact. So all I would like to suggest at this point is to keep it as a topic of interest and to add the risk analysis to that discussion.
Tom, it's Rick Morose. Let me just jump in here. Two comments. The first is I would agree with keep it. I also, just for what it's worth, and we've had some of these conversations before, and people have them elsewhere. Depends on the context in which we're talking about resilience. What's it mean? What's it for? Is it redundant fuel supply? Is it hardening of transmission? Is it hardening of the distribution system? What is it and what context? So you do have to define it. And recall too, we did refer back to the department, the suggestion that the department craft a handbook, particularly focused on metrics that could be used in any one of those contexts for valuing, quote, resilience. So I think we have a track record of trying to confront the issue, define it, and even look to tools that could be used to further resilience, whatever that means. It means paying for it as much as anything.
This is Flora. I would just like to add to that, Rick, that I think this is, you really highlight a lot of the reasons why we do need to keep talking about this and keep tackling it, because there are so many questions. And I think that we could really identify a lot of opportunities here for DOE to help kind of lead the discussions and lead the analysis and help the industry sort out what we're doing with this, because it really is a challenge.
Yeah. This is Joe. I just want to, with respect to your comments, this resilience today is kind of like how grid modernization was like 10 years ago. You go into a room with 30 people to talk about grid mod. And everybody would come at it from a completely different perspective. And then after 3 hours, you'd walk out and nothing was solved. So the way I'm going to share this, I'm sorry. I think in terms of putting context around resilience, we have to think about it in terms of planning processes. How do we incorporate resilience considerations into current day planning processes? And given that, what are the respective roles and responsibilities of the players? A. B, let's draw out what a planning process is, whether it's IRP or integrated distribution system plan or the combination of those plans, and figure out how resilience, like where does risk analysis actually fit into that planning process, fit into developing objectives, fit into the engineering solution of the planning process. And then what analytical methods do we need to be able to support the planning process? So there's a framework here that fits into planning processes. And if we don't develop that framework, we're going to be all over the friggin' place, just like we were with the grid mod discussion. So this is a matter which is really dear to me. And so I come from a really biased, I've created this thing in my mind that maybe I should get off of, but I just want to express it to you, okay? Because we need a framework for it. We need, and it has to be applied to a decision process. So in the planning process. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Okay, Tom, I think they've weighed in. Resiliency is important, and we also have the critical infrastructure focus, so they tie together as well.
Yeah, and that's what I took away too, is that given the DCEI effort as well, that this sort of plays into it, because I think one can envision how, what does resiliency and I think to the point that you made, Richard, the context under which, right? So it means something for defense critical electric infrastructure. It needs something else for perhaps an individual customer. It needs something for a city or a state or whatever it is. And the context under, for example, the type of extreme events, right? So, you look here in California with all the wildfires, and there's been some interesting articles that have come out lately that said even though, the state added something like 2,000 megawatts of new PV in the state this year, the overall production numbers, given the fires and given the smoke and everything else, is down 20% or something like that overall, year over year. So there's a lot of really interesting issues with regards to this, and I think context becomes. I agree, context is really important. So okay. Anything else? Okay. Well, hearing none, then Wanda, I will turn it back over to you.
All right. Well, great report, Tom. Appreciate it. And Darlene, I think at this point we're ready to see if there's any public comments. Chris, did you have anybody raise their hand for that?
There are nobody I see in the chat room or on the participants list has raised their hand. So I think we have the all clear here, Wanda. Going once, going twice. On to Wanda.
All right. No public comments. Well, I just want to say thanks to everybody, both presenters and members, for a really rich dialogue, both yesterday and today. It's been tremendous. New members, thank you so much for jumping in there full force right from the beginning. Great contributions. I think in DOE folks, Chris, Chuck, Joe, Johanna, Jen, appreciate all that you did for, bringing content forward and do the organization of these panels. And, the panel material is exceptional. So anyway, awesome. As far as follow-ups go, remember we're going to have that critical infrastructure subcommittee. Chris is going to get a note out, so I ask for those of you that want to participate and or lead, make sure you respond to that, and we'll get things organized and set up by our next meeting. I would say the subcommittees, we need to be thinking about the material for next year. Our next meetings are, again, February 3rd, 4th, and the next one after that is May 5th, 6th. So as we think about content that's coming forward, those meetings are relatively close. So we're going to have to contemplate kind of a 1-2 punch to get our materials organized. I know that there's a good running start on both the subcommittee for smart grid and storage, and I mean, great reports to both subcommittees here, but it's going to take a lot of organization, as it always does. Joe, we look forward to the smart grid report. We stand ready to review. Sounds like, what, the week after, end of the week, next week or something. So we'll keep that in mind. And then I did want to mention, you know, for our ethics briefing, we were asked by Stephanie to get an email back to her to validate that we took it. I think that Chris is probably going to backstop us with the ones that were listed there in WebEx, but still she did ask for a written confirmation for our participation. And I think, you know, that's pretty much what I have on you know, kind of logistics here. I really, really appreciate the dialogue, as I know DOE does as well. Are there any other questions or comments for the good of the cause before we wrap it up? Well, I take that silence as an adjourn. So anyway, be safe, stay well, and thank you so much for your service. Take care.
Thank you, Wanda. Have fun, folks. Stay well.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody.